What if entire civilizations, cities of gold, mountain kingdoms and desert empires rose, thrived, and then vanished? Some were lost in ferocious battles, others succumbed to a slow, desperate decline. Climate change, political or social turmoil, the relentless tides of history simply moved on. Many disappeared as if they'd never existed. From the jungles of Central America to the frozen coastlines of Canada, and from the barren sands of the Sahara to the very heart of Europe, these lost stories remain whispered in legend or recorded in ancient scripts that no one alive can decipher. These are the tales of civilizations that defied time until time ultimately erased them. Some vanished in one violent night, while others gradually faded over the centuries. These great civilizations influenced the course of human history in ways we may not fully understand today. They were once proud pillars of humanity before crumbling, collapsing, and in many cases, disappearing entirely. Imagine large cities bustling with trade and engineered with surgical precision. Streets are paved in perfect grids wide enough for carts, while homes are constructed from kiln-fired bricks and even include private bathrooms. At the heart of each metropolis lies a complex drainage system so advanced that even some modern engineers still scratch their heads at it. This was the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and many more. 5,000 years ago, while Europe was still fumbling through the Neolithic era, the people of the Indus Valley were already writing, building, and bartering across a landscape that spanned over 500,000 square kilometers. And then they vanished. There was no final battle, no grand collapse. It was just silence. We still haven't deciphered their language. Their script, etched onto thousands of stone seals, remains undeciphered. There is no Rosetta Stone to guide us. Yet the signs remain carved into clay and stone, unicorns, geometric shapes, and a curious blend of ritual and logic. It's like staring at a message from an alien world. The cities were unusual. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley left no towering monuments to kings or gods, no megalomaniac pharaohs, and no grand temples. These cities were built for the people, not for show. They were functional, egalitarian, and organized. Then, around 1900 BCE, something changed. Slowly and methodically, life drained from the cities. Wells dried up, bricks became smaller and cheaper, streets cracked, trade routes frayed. The carefully designed order gave way to a quiet chaos. People began leaving, first one by one and then en masse. But why? Some suggest it was the climate, that the mighty Sarasvati River, the lifeline of their world, shifted or dried up entirely. Others blame an earthquake or a massive drought. Still others whisper about invaders, tribes from the northwest who pressed too hard too fast. What is eerie is how bloodless it all seems. There are no mass graves or signs of fiery destruction, just abandonment. Walk through the ruins today and you'll feel it, that lingering stillness. It's as if the cities are not dead, they merely paused, waiting for someone to hear their story. Here was a people who mastered urban living thousands of years ahead of their time, building with care, governing with restraint, and disappearing without a scream. A civilization that left behind no kings, no wars, no declarations of power, only plumbing, precision, and silence. In the steamy heart of Central America, great stone cities rise from the canopy like half-buried dreams. Thick vines snake through crumbling pyramids while macaws screech overhead. The jungle has reclaimed much, but not all, of what the Maya once left behind. They were astronomers, architects, mathematicians, priests, and warriors. They charted the heavens with staggering precision, built towering temples without metal tools, and devised an intricate calendar that still humbles modern minds. By the first millennium CE, they had filled the lowlands with sprawling city-states, Tikar, Kapan, Kalakmul, each vibrant with ceremony, commerce, and cosmic thinking. But then it all changed. Between 750 and 900 CE, something unraveled. Great plazas emptied, monuments ceased to be carved, and entire cities were abandoned, left to the vines and to the bats. In some places, people simply walked away. In others, they stayed and starved. Some blame a series of brutal droughts. The Maya depended heavily on rainwater, storing it in vast underground reservoirs. When the skies failed, so did the crops, and starvation, conflict, and desperation may have set in. Others point to warfare, city fighting city, power fracturing, trade routes splintering. Some scholars argue that political collapse was key, that the kings lost control, the gods fell silent, and belief itself crumbled. But none of these explanations fully capture the picture. While the lowland heartlands were falling, some Maya cities in the highlands persisted, with a few thriving even centuries later. This wasn't a single cataclysm, but a gradual, messy decline, like a great light flickering out, one flame at a time. What makes the Maya so haunting isn't just their disappearance, it's what they left behind and how much still eludes our understanding. The glyphs, once indecipherable, have now been partially translated, unveiling a world of blood sacrifice, dynastic struggle, and cosmic prophecy. They spoke of gods with jaguar faces and serpents in the sky. They described time as a living entity measured in vast and dizzying cycles. And their ruins, those vast, echoing temples, still stand shrouded in the jungle mist, resonating with the footsteps of those who once gazed at the stars and saw gods dancing in the darkness. The Maya did not vanish entirely. Their descendants live on, and their language continues to be spoken in villages throughout Guatemala and Mexico. Yet the grandeur, the empire, the power that once carved cities from stone and mapped eternity across the heavens, all of that faded away, leaving behind mysterious riddles etched in limestone and an enduring silence that no one can fully explain. A gentle wind stirs through the empty alcoves of Mesa Verde, whispering against stone walls that once rang with voices, laughter, and the rhythm of everyday life. Deep within the cliffs, hundreds of rooms are carved into the rock like a delicate honeycomb, multi-story dwellings, each block carefully shaped and fitted, now lying eerily still. For over 700 years, the ancestral Puebloans called this unforgiving region home. They were ingenious, farmers coaxing maize from dry, cracked soil, potters adorning every surface with intricate designs, and skywatchers tracking the sun's movement with astonishing accuracy. In the high desert, they didn't merely survive, they thrived. Around 600 CE, they began building above ground, creating villages with plazas and kivas, circular subterranean chambers used for ceremony. By 1200 CE, they had taken to the cliffs, chiseling vast settlements into sheltered rock faces. These were not simple hideouts. They were architectural marvels, complete with rooms, storage spaces, staircases, and ventilation systems. An entire world wedged between earth and sky. Then, within a single generation, they were gone, not faded away, but left behind. Entire cliff cities lay empty, with tools and pottery scattered as though they intended to return. But they never did. So what happened? Drought is the most common suspect here. Tree ring records hint at decades of dry years. When water vanished, everything else followed. Yet climate alone cannot explain the scale of the abandonment. There are also signs of conflict, burned structures, fortified villages, and changes in how people lived. It is possible they weren't just starving, they were afraid. Some archaeologists believe internal pressures reached a breaking point. Overcrowding, competition for resources, and perhaps even a spiritual crisis. Others propose that new religious movements or alliances pushed people south and east toward what became the Pueblo cultures of New Mexico and Arizona. What is peculiar is how abruptly it all stopped. Construction halted, the kivas fell silent, the last fires flickered out. And yet these people did not vanish into myth. Their descendants live on. The Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples still recount the legacy of those who came before. They continue to carry the stories, songs, and ceremonies across the centuries. For them, the ancestral Puebloans are not a mystery to be solved, but ancestors to be remembered. In the sultry lowlands of southern Mexico, colossal heads lie scattered like forgotten sentinels. Carved from volcanic basalt and weighing over 20 tons in some cases, their faces remain frozen in eternal watchfulness, marked by broad noses, thick lips, and helmeted brows. No one knows for certain who they represent. Warriors, kings, maybe gods. What we do know is that the civilization behind these mysterious sculptures, the Olmec, were among the first to rise in Mesoamerica. Yet they left behind far more questions than answers. Emerging around 1600 BCE, the Olmec built vast ceremonial centers in a landscape dominated by swamps, rivers, and dense forests. Sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta were not cities in the modern sense. Rather, they served as ritual hubs and spiritual crossroads where priests, rulers, and artisans shaped culture itself. The Olmec developed a writing system long before the Maya and may have invented the famed Mesoamerican ballgame. Some scholars even argue that they created the earliest known calendar in the Americas. And then they vanished. By 400 BCE, their great centers lay abandoned, their monuments toppled or buried. Once visible from the Pacific to the Gulf, their influence faded like mist at dawn. But they didn't simply crumble away. The Olmec story doesn't end in fire or invasion. There is no evidence of massive conflict, nor are there any signs of plague. Instead, it feels as though the heart of their civilization simply stopped beating. Environmental shifts may have played a role. Rivers changed course, and croplands may have failed. Some speculate that internal upheaval was to blame. Perhaps the ruling class lost control, or their belief systems fractured. Others wonder if the Olmec didn't truly disappear, but instead evolved, blending into emerging cultures such as the Maya and the Zapotec, their ideas carried forward under different names. What makes it also compelling is the extent of the Olmec influence on the world around them. Their distinctive and powerful art appears throughout later cultures, and their gods, with snarling jaguar mouths and downturned eyes, resonate through Mesoamerican religion. It's as if they planted the seed and then stepped back into the shadows. And those heads still remain, not toppled, not broken, just sitting there in the jungle, watching. Tucked away in the arid canyons of southern Jordan lies a city not carved from stone, but carved into it, Petra. This rose-red labyrinth of tombs, temples, and facades is etched directly into sandstone cliffs. At dawn, the rocks glow like embers. By dusk, they darken to a burnt crimson, evoking the feel of a dream rather than mere ruin. Yet this was no illusion. Petra was the beating heart of a desert empire, and its builders, the Nabataeans, were masters of an art that few could claim: survival through ingenuity. Nomads turned architects and traders turned kings. The Nabataeans rose not by war, but by mastering water. In a land where rain was rare and rivers were non-existent, they engineered a network of cisterns, channels, and reservoirs that captured every precious drop. It is said that Petra could sustain tens of thousands, even through the harshest seasons. Their ingenuity brought them immense wealth. Sitting astride ancient trade routes, they controlled the flow of incense, spices, silk, and gold. Camel caravans from Arabia and goods from India passed through their hands, while their unique Nabataean Aramaic language adorned every market stall and temple wall. And yet, their wealth did not breed arrogance. Their city was not a fortress, rather it was a statement of culture and confidence. Monumental tombs, Greco-Roman columns, and intricate carvings spoke of far-reaching global ties and a civilization that regarded itself not as isolated, but as central. But then the voices fell quiet. By the 2nd century CE, Petra began to fade. The Romans had annexed the Nabataean Kingdom in 106 CE, and although the city endured for some time, its pulse gradually slowed. Trade routes shifted, the incense road cooled, and a major earthquake in 363 CE crippled Petra's infrastructure. From that point on, silence crept in. There was no grand collapse, no legendary battle, only the long, slow retreat of life from stone. The Nabataeans left behind no sprawling texts or epic myths, and much of who they were remains shrouded in mystery. Were they a single tribe or a network of clans? Did they have kings, high priests, or perhaps both? And what ancient rituals once echoed from the great high place of sacrifice? We don't know. All we have are the stones, the carvings, the water channels still slick with desert dust, and that lingering feeling of glorious abandonment when you stand in Petra's narrow canyon, the Sick. Long before Rome became an empire, there was another civilization, older, stranger, more enigmatic: the Etruscans. They lived in the hills and coastal plains of what is now Tuscany and Lazio. Their cities, Verli, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, flourished with color, sound, and the aroma of incense rising from smoky temples. And yet today, most people barely know their name. At the peak of their power, the Etruscans were the dominant force in central Italy. Traders, warriors, engineers, and artists, they taught the Romans how to build roads and arches, and even how to stage gladiatorial games, though the Etruscans themselves were not quite so bloodthirsty. Their language still resists full translation. Unlike Latin or Greek, it wasn't Indo-European. It stands almost alone. We can read their words, at least phonetically, but the deeper meanings often remain out of reach. Their tombs, on the other hand, they speak volumes. Beneath rolling hills lie vast necropolises, cities for the dead. Painted walls depict banquets, dances, and chariot races, scenes not of mourning but of vibrant life. For the Etruscans, death was not an end, it was a transition. They lived with the gods close by and did not fear the shadows. So what happened to them? Well, they didn't vanish overnight. Their decline was not marked by a sudden collapse, but by a slow erosion, a gradual Roman tide. By the 4th century BCE, Roman influence began to seep into Etruscan life. Once fiercely independent, their city-states began to falter militarily, culturally, and politically. Some resisted, others formed alliances. Over time, however, their distinct identity thinned. Latin replaced Etruscan, and Roman customs took over traditional rituals. Their gods either merged with the Roman deities or were forgotten entirely. By the time of the Empire, the Etruscans had become little more than a footnote, a people abandoned so completely that it is difficult to say where they ended and Rome began. And yet traces remain. The she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, that image springs from Etruscan bronze work. The Roman alphabet, it was borrowed, adapted from Etruscan script. Even Rome's early kings, the Tarquins, were of Etruscan blood. Their fingerprints are scattered across the very foundations of Rome's greatness. But what did they call themselves? Was it Etruscan or Rasenna, as some sources suggest? And what did they believe in the stillness of their own temples, hidden far from Roman eyes? We may never truly know. Much of what we understand comes second-hand, filtered through Roman historians who held little affection for the peoples they had overcome. The Etruscans did not exit with a bang, and they never needed to. They quietly stepped into the luminous shadow of Rome, leaving behind a puzzle wrapped in murals, myths, and mystery. In the heart of North America, where the Mississippi River winds like a restless serpent through plains and forests, there arose a civilization few have heard of and even fewer understand. Their cities were vast, their mounds monumental, their influence stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. And at the center of it all was Cahokia. Around 1050 CE, this place burst into life. It became a teeming, thriving city of perhaps 15,000 inhabitants. Some estimate even higher. At the time, it may have been the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica. London, Paris, and even New York hadn't yet emerged in their modern forms, but here, near present-day St. Louis, massive earthen pyramids, wooden palisades, ceremonial plazas, and vibrant neighborhoods thrived with ritual and routine. Monk's Mound, the largest among them, still dominates the landscape. Nearly 100 feet high, it would have required millions of hand-woven baskets of earth to build, as there were no metal tools or draft animals, only human will and determination making a towering mound of soil. The Mississippians were more than just mound builders, they were spiritual engineers. Their cities aligned with solstices and celestial events, and their artwork, intricate shell engravings, copper plates, and effigies of birds and warriors evoked a universe where the earth, sky, and the underworld continuously merged. And then, not long after 1300 CE, they disappeared. Cahokia emptied, the mounds were abandoned, the ceremonies stopped. There was no written language, no recorded wars, and no obvious disaster. There was just mystery. Some believe environmental stress took its toll, deforestation, overfarming, and flooding. Others point to political unrest. Signs such as palisades and mass burial suggest rising tensions and even violence. There may also have been disease, there may have been drought, or it might simply have been that the structure holding it all together, whatever social or spiritual glue bounds the people to the mounds, broke down. The descendants of the Mississippians lived on. The Natchez, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and others, they all still carry echoes of that once vibrant culture. But the grandeur, the cities, the monumental scale, the unifying force, that never returned. Today, Cahokia sits eerily still. Grass-covered mounds rise like buried memories. Highways hum nearby, yet the site itself remains deathly quiet. Perhaps it is too quiet for a place that once drew pilgrims, traders, and leaders from around the continent. No myth explains its fall. No legends point to its end. Perhaps that is what makes the Mississippians so haunting. They built something truly remarkable, and then simply walked away. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, where the terrain rises into jagged mountains and morning mists cling to deep valleys, an empire once ruled both land and sea. The Aksumites were traders, warriors, and master builders of obelisks and legends. At their peak, they were a superpower, yet most people have never even heard of them. They emerged around the 1st century CE, initially quietly, But within a few generations, Aksum had seized control of Red Sea trade. Their ships transported ivory, gold, spices, and slaves to Egypt, Persia, and even India. Roman coins had been discovered in their bustling markets, and silk from China passed through their harbors. They boasted their own currency, their own alphabet, and their own kings, mysterious, powerful, proud. And their monuments? Well, they were breathtaking. The stelae, towering granite obelisks, some over 30 meters tall, still loom over the city of Aksum today. Carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false windows and doors, they mark royal tombs buried deep underground. One was so massive that it's thought to have been the largest monolith ever attempted by ancient engineers. Although it cracked during construction, it still lies exactly where it fell. These were not the works of mere tribal chiefs. This was an organized, centralized, and literate kingdom. Aksum even appears on the Roman world map, the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a place of influence, wealth, and kings who rode elephants. And then came the conversion. In the 4th century, under King Ezana, Aksum embraced Christianity, becoming one of the first nations in the world to do so. Long before Rome made the leap, Ethiopia was minting coins with crosses and carving churches from stone. It was a bold move, a decisive break from the gods of the past. And for quite a while it worked. But then, it didn't. By the 7th century, Aksum began its slow decline. Trade routes shifted as Islam spread across North Africa and Arabia and the Red Sea, once the empire's lifeblood, became increasingly difficult to navigate. Some attribute its downfall to climate change, with falling rains and thinning harvests, while others point to internal fractures. Whatever the cause, the empire started to wither. Step by step, Aksum deliberately withdrew. Its rulers retreated southward into the highlands, and as a consequence, the great obelisks toppled, the coins ceased to be minted, and the silence deepened. Yet the legacy endured. Ethiopian tradition maintains that the Solomonic dynasty, which reigned for centuries, traced its lineage back to Aksum and even further to the legendary Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Today, the ruins still stand, stones weathered by time scattered across lush green hills. There was no grand farewell, no final war, and no neat ending to this storied empire. Instead, it quietly turned its back on the world and vanished into the highlands, leaving behind an enduring mystery. Deep in the Cambodian jungle, where vines twist like snakes around ancient stone and the air hangs heavy with heat, towers emerge from the lush green like fossilized lotus buds. Angkor Wat stands there, not merely a temple, but the relic of a lost world, the final echo of an empire that once ruled half of Southeast Asia. The Khmer Empire did more than build temples, they crafted cities on an almost unimaginable scale. Angkor was far from an isolated complex. It formed part of a vast metropolis, possibly the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. Hidden beneath the jungle, LiDAR scans have uncovered a network of roads, canals, reservoirs, neighborhoods, and shrines stretching across hundreds of square kilometers, an engineered landscape that is both precise and awe-inspiring. It all began around the 9th century, when Jayavarman II declared himself a god king, uniting scattered tribes into a formidable power. Over the ensuing centuries, Khmer rulers erected monument after monument, each one grander than its predecessor. Tar Prom, Barn, Prayer Khan, temples interwoven with stone faces, entwined tree roots, and the relentless passage of time. They mastered water. That was their secret. Giant bares, or man-made reservoirs, fed the rice fields that sustained a vast population, numbering nearly 1 million at its peak. The system was delicate yet efficient. Control the water, and you control the empire. For hundreds of years, the Khmer dominated the region. They waged battles against neighboring kingdoms, absorbed diverse cultures, and built a society rooted first in Hinduism and later in Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. Their art fused sensuality with symbolism, while their architecture soared skyward, its reflections shimmering in the moats below. Then, by the 15th century, they had faded, not erased or shattered by a single cataclysm, but diminished over time. Great temples were gradually reclaimed by the jungle, the capital shifted south, and the once magnificent grandeur began to fade. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly why. Some attribute the decline to environmental mismanagement. The water system may have grown too complex and fragile, with floods, droughts, and silted canals choking the empire's lifeblood. Others argue that invasions from Siam, internal strife shifts in religious beliefs, and political decay all played a role in the empire's ultimate downfall. More likely, it was all of these, a slow, uneven unraveling. The jungle did what jungles do. It crept in, it took over, and concealed the past between roots and silence. Yet the stones remain, faces carved in rock, half smiling, half watching. They still tell their story. Bas-reliefs depict battles, processions, and scenes of everyday life, fishing, dancing, laughing. The Khmer did not vanish completely. Their descendants still inhabit Cambodia, and their legacy endures in the language, religion, and identity of the people. Still, the dazzling Khmer Empire eventually faded away. Before the glory of classical Athens, before the temples of Delphi and the philosophers in the white robes, there were the Mycenaeans, stone fortress dwellers, seafarers and storytellers who laid the foundations of Greek civilization. Their world was one of gold, war, and gods whose whispers resonated through fire and sky. The ruins of Mycenae still stand high above the plain, silent and steadfast. The Cyclopean walls are so massive and rugged that early Greeks believed giants had built them. At the gate, a carved pair of lions appears frozen mid-roar, guarding the memory of an age that danced between history and myth. If you believe Homer, this was the world of Agamemnon. The Mycenaeans were said to have sailed to Troy, fought a 10-year war, and returned as broken kings. Whether that war actually happened or not, their culture certainly did. From roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, the Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean. Their palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, served as centers of bureaucracy and ritual. They recorded their transactions in Linear B, an early form of Greek used primarily for keeping records of trade, taxation, and livestock. It was a practical script rather than a poetic one. And yet, there was poetry in their lives. They constructed tholos tombs, beehive-shaped stone vaults for their dead, and they carved exquisite masks from gold. They engaged in trade with Egypt, Crete, and the Hittites. Their ships sailed the Mediterranean, their warriors marched under banners emblazoned with bulls and boars. And then came the collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the palaces burned, cities were abandoned, and the script faded from use. Within a generation, the vibrant Mycenaean world fell silent. So what went wrong? Well, theories abound. Earthquakes, invasion, internal rebellion. The enigmatic sea peoples are often held responsible, a shadowy force that swept across the eastern Mediterranean at the same time, leaving chaos in its wake. Or perhaps it wasn't a single cause at all. Maybe it was a perfect storm, trade routes breaking down, harvests failing, and political structures collapsing under their own weight. What is truly chilling is the totality of the collapse. Greece was plunged into a dark age. Writing vanished and monumental architecture ceased. It would take centuries for the Greeks to rise again, and by then the memory of the Mycenaeans had faded into legend. Today, you can still walk beneath the imposing arch of the Lion Gate. You can stand inside those ancient tombs and look up at the corbelled ceilings, silently wondering about those who once lay beneath them. Yet you won't find many concrete answers, only echoes of a bygone era. The Mycenaeans left behind a world half-remembered, a tapestry woven from both fact and fable. Somewhere between the tales of the Iliad and the enduring stone lies the truth about a people who once ruled an age of heroes only to vanish into myth. The island of Crete basks under the Mediterranean sun, its shores kissed by turquoise waters and breezes laced with salt. But hidden beneath its hills and along its harbors lies the story of a people who flourished long before the Greeks were even Greeks, a civilization as elegant as it is mysterious. The Minoans. Named after the mythical king Minos, although we don't know what they called themselves, they emerged around 3000 BCE and thrived for nearly 2 millennia. Their heart was Knossos, a sprawling complex once thought to be a palace but now believed to have been a labyrinth city. Multi-storied and brightly painted, it was filled with light wells, staircases and storerooms. There were no towering walls or warlike murals, only open architecture and vivid art. Their frescoes burst with life, women in flowing robes leaping over bulls, dancers captured mid-spin, and dolphins arcing through blue seas. This was not a culture obsessed with conquest, it was a culture of grace, movement, and seafaring trade. They worshipped goddesses, carved snake priestesses, and sacred horns filled their sanctuaries. Their writing, Linear A, remains undeciphered, a script as silent today as the dust-covered rooms where it was once etched onto clay tablets. At their height, the Minoans dominated the Aegean. Their ships sailed in every direction, north to the Cyclades, south to Egypt, exporting olive oil, pottery, and metalwork. Though they were no empire in the traditional sense, with neither a standing army nor conquered lands, their influence extended far across the sea. Then, something changed. Around 1450 BCE, their major palaces, save for Knossos, were destroyed by fire. The devastation was sudden, brutal, and eerily synchronized. But who struck the match? Well, no one knows for certain. Some blame the Mycenaeans, who may have invaded or seized control, while others point to a volcanic eruption, the cataclysm at Thera, modern-day Santorini, one of the largest in history. The eruption did not hit Crete directly, but its shockwaves, in the form of tsunamis, ashfall, and disrupted weather, may have crippled the Minoan society. Crops failed, trade halted, and faith faltered. Knossos managed to limp on under Mycenaean influence, but the unique Minoan identity quickly faded. Within a century or two, Linear A was replaced by Linear B, and the artistry of the bull leapers was gone. Today, the ruins at Knossos are a blend of reconstruction and theory, a place where archaeology merges with imagination. Was there really a labyrinth, a minotaur? Probably not. Yet myths often grow from a kernel of truth, and if you stand among the ruins long enough with the wind sighing through the broken columns, you can sense that something truly grand once existed here. Before the pyramids soared, before Stonehenge stood, and before writing left its first marks on clay, there was Trypillia. In the rolling hills and broad river valleys of Eastern Europe, a forgotten culture once painted spirals on pottery, intentionally burned its villages to the ground, and built cities unlike anything seen elsewhere in Neolithic Europe. Known today as the Cucuteni-Trypillia civilization, they flourished from around 5400 to 2700 BCE, yet hardly anyone has heard of them. But they were there. Across what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, enormous settlements were built, some with populations reaching into the thousands. One site, at its peak, spanned over 300 hectares, making it larger than most cities of the ancient world. There were no stone walls or temples, just wide concentric rings of homes, many carefully placed, built with 2 stories and featuring indoor ovens. Then, every 60 to 80 years, these entire settlements were deliberately burned down. They would rebuild their communities, live in them for decades, and then set fire to every structure, a ritualistic act rather than an accidental occurrence or a product of warfare. Evidence of this practice is found in countless sites marked by burnt clay and scorched earth. It became a kind of symbolic reset, signifying both an ending and a new beginning. But why did this remain a mystery? The society behind these settlements appears to have been peaceful. No significant evidence of weapons or conflict has been discovered. Their artistic expressions, however, are rich and layered, ranging from ceramic figurines, possibly representing fertility goddesses with swollen hips and abstract eyes, to pottery etched with hypnotic patterns. It seems that each bowl was meant not just to hold grain, but also to encapsulate a vision. They had no written language, no grand monuments, yet their culture spans nearly 2 millennia, longer than ancient Egypt's most iconic period. Then, at around 2700 BCE, they simply vanished. It was not a slow decline. Their settlements just stopped. The fires no longer burned. The pottery ceased, and the houses were no longer rebuilt. Some say climate change played a role, with droughts and failing harvests, while others suggest they were absorbed by steppe tribes moving in from the east. Perhaps they abandoned the old ways, or maybe the ritual of burning lost its significance. There are no great legends about them, no oral traditions that have survived the ages, only ash, pottery, and mystery. Yet when you gaze upon those swirling symmetrical patterns on their vessels, you feel a presence, something that speaks across time, a civilization with its own rhythm, its own truth. One that left no great cities standing, only the quiet traces of fire. High in the Anatolian plateau, where snow dusts the hills in winter and dry heat settles in summer, once stood the heart of a forgotten empire. The Hittites, known as stone-blooded kings, lawgivers, and chariot-lords, ruled a land defined by both war and diplomacy, a place of treaties and thunder gods, long before much of Europe had raised a single stone. For millennia, however, they were nearly forgotten. It wasn't until the 19th century when archaeologists in modern-day Turkey began unearthing mysterious ruins, deciphering inscriptions in an unknown language, and uncovering massive fortifications, temples, archives, and fragments of a vanished world that the true significance of the Hittites came to light. They were not merely a footnote in history, they were a formidable power. At their zenith, around 1300 BCE, they controlled an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the brink of Mesopotamia. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel in itself, encircled by towering walls filled with elegant temples and featuring carved gates guarded by imposing lions and sphinxes. The Hittites corresponded with the pharaohs of Egypt, engaging in trade with Babylon, and held rivalries with almost anybody else. And they wrote. Thousands of clay tablets, still legible, fill their archives. They recorded laws, rituals, treaties, their unique version of the world. Most famous of all is the world's first known peace treaty, struck after the brutal Battle of Kadesh with Ramesses II of Egypt. Yet, despite their power, the Hittites remain an enigma. Their language, Hittite, stands as the oldest known Indo-European tongue. Their religion, a mix of native gods and borrowed deities, was fluid and adaptable. They absorbed cultures rather than crushing them, a strategy that proved both their strength and ultimately their weakness. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire crumbled. Hattusa burned, cities were abandoned, and the record fell silent. No one is entirely sure why. Theories swirl: famine, drought, internal rebellion, and shifting alliances. They all make the list. And then there is the spectre of the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who swept through the eastern Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and scattering survivors. But what makes their disappearance so striking is how completely they were forgotten. Unlike Egypt, which endured, or Mesopotamia, which still echoes in our collective memory, the Hittites simply vanished. Until just a few decades ago, their story was lost, not due to conquest, but through the slow erosion of time. Today, we reconstruct their legacy from ruins, clay fragments, broken tablets, and walls battered by storms. Their names live again, but they remain like the half-ghosts, their thoughts locked within scripts we can only partially read. They ruled an empire. They articulated laws and marched in chariots, and then they turned to dust. Long before pyramids rose or empires marched, when mammoths still roamed the plains and the Ice Age was drawing its final breath, a group of people hunted across North Africa, silent, skilled, and destined to vanish. We call them the Clovis. They left no cities, no palaces, no stone-carved temples, only points, sleek, fluted spearheads of such refined technique that they still gleam under museum glass even after thousands of years. Buried in ancient soil alongside bison bones, mammoth ribs, and relics of a vanished world, they remain a fleeting presence in history. They appeared abruptly around 13,000 years ago, and just as suddenly they disappeared. What we know about them comes mostly from their tools. Clovis points have been found stretching from New Mexico to Nova Scotia and from Montana to Florida. The craftsmanship is unmistakable. Long, leaf-shaped blades designed to kill large game quickly and efficiently. These people were not crude survivalists, they were specialists, masters of flint and obsidian. And then, they were gone. Within a few hundred years, the Clovis culture vanished. The points ceased to appear, and all traces of their way of life faded away. Other groups continued, evolved, and spread, but Clovis itself, whatever it was, came to an abrupt end. Theories about their disappearance come and go. One of the oldest holds that they became victims of their own successes. Overhunting may have led to the extinction of the megafauna on which they depended. However, that explanation alone does not hold up, as mammoths were dying off globally while other groups managed to survive without them. Another theory suggests an environmental collapse. The onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions, occurred around the same time. A drop in temperature, shifts in rainfall, and chaotic changes in ecosystems would have made life harder, resources scarcer, and migration more urgent. And then there's the impact theory. Some scientists believe that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere, triggering widespread wildfires, decimating species, and disrupting early human cultures. The evidence remains debated, but if it holds true, the Clovis culture might have ended amid fire and sky. Alternatively, these people may not have vanished completely. They might have simply transformed, integrating into new cultures and ways of life. When history leaves no written record, the line between disappearance and transformation is always blurred. What remains are the spearheads, still sharp enough to draw blood, uncovered beneath layers of time. They continue to whisper of a people who mastered the hunt, witnessed the fall of the mammoth, and eventually faded into the land they once roamed. No temples, no myths, just stone and the silence of deep time. At the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, where southern Spain meets the sea, once shimmered a kingdom named Tartessos. To the ancient Greeks, it was a place of riches beyond reckoning, where silver flowed like water and kings spoke in riddles. And then it vanished. The Tartessians were among the first complex cultures in Western Europe. Around the 9th century BCE, their influence blossomed across the Iberian Peninsula. They built cities, engaged in Mediterranean trade, and even developed a script that remains undeciphered. They had their own gods, language, and unique rhythm. The Greek historian Herodotus described them as the richest people in the world. He recounted the long 80-year reign of King Arganthonios, who welcomed Greek traders with open arms. The Greeks adored Tartessos, viewing it as a golden land where the ancient met something even older. They were not mistaken. Tartessian territory was abundant in metals, gold, silver, and copper, all of which were mined, refined, and exported from its thriving ports. They traded with the Phoenicians, Carthage, and possibly even Egypt. Some scholars believe that Tartessos may have inspired the legend of Atlantis, an advanced, affluent, and proud city that was ultimately swallowed by the sea. But around 500 BCE, the story comes to an abrupt end. The city's emptied, trade halted, and the name Tartessos vanished from all records. Greek sailors fell silent, and the silver trail grew cold. So what happened? Well, no one knows for sure. Some blame Carthage, the rising Phoenician power to the south. Perhaps they crushed Tartessos to seize control of Iberian trade. Others point to environmental shifts, flooding in the lowlands, and the salinization of farmland. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither. Archaeologists have uncovered tombs, vast hoards of gold, and evidence of exquisite craftsmanship, clear signs of a refined and wealthy culture. Yet the cities themselves remain largely hidden. If they lie buried beneath modern Seville, they are concealed too deep. And if they were once coastal, perhaps the sea has claimed them, eroding them away with tide and time. After centuries of contact and commerce, Tartessos disappears as if someone had snuffed out a flame. There are no legends, no epic tales, only the occasional glint of silver in the dirt. Still, its presence lingers in the myths of lost kingdoms, in the undeciphered glyphs etched into stones, and in the enduring question, how can a civilization that was once so visible and so vivid simply vanish? Tartessos was real, there's no doubt about that. Yet, like so many others presented here, it now exists as a riddle wrapped in gold and shadow. In the vast reach of the Aksumite Empire, an influential African kingdom that traded with Rome and Persia, raised stelae skyward, and embraced Christianity as early as the 4th century, a lesser-known story unfolds. It's a tale that has been recorded less often and spoken of more in whispers. This is the story of the Jewish kings of Ethiopia. It is not merely the account of one dynasty. It is a legacy, a hidden thread woven through Ethiopia's rich and complex past. This legacy is tied to the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews who trace their lineage back to ancient times and to rulers claiming descent from none other than King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The narrative begins in legend. According to the Khmer Empire, the Queen of Sheba, known as Makeda, journeyed to Jerusalem, where she bore Solomon a child, Menelik I. He would later return to Ethiopia, bearing the Ark of the Covenant itself. Whether this story is rooted in myth or memory, it has shaped centuries of Ethiopian royal authority. But what about the Jewish dynasty? Well, that's harder to trace. By the 4th century CE, when the Aksumite Empire officially embraced Christianity under King Azana, not everyone converted, and some groups resisted the change. Others remained Jewish by heritage, belief, or custom, especially in the mountainous regions to the north and west, where Beta Israel communities grew strong, independent, and increasingly isolated. Sometime between the 9th and 14th centuries, these communities may have formed their own kingdom, often referred to in oral tradition as the Kingdom of Semyon, or simply the Jewish Kingdom. Its rulers were said to descend from Menelik, separate from the Solomonic Christian line. They lived in the highlands, built their own fortresses, observed the Sabbath, practiced Mosaic law, and remained steadfast while the Christian empire to the south grew in power. Then came conflict. Emperors of the Ethiopian highlands launched campaigns against these rebellious people. One queen, Gadit or Yodit, is said to have sacked Aksum in the 10th century, possibly acting as a Beta Israel leader or ally. Whether historical or apocryphal, her name means destroyer, and her legend lives on in ruins and ash. By the 15th century, the Beta Israel kingdom stood besieged. Emperor Yeshak I defeated their forces and imposed Christianity by force. Their lands were seized and their leaders imprisoned. The dynasty didn't merely collapse, it underwent a crushing erasure. Beta Israel would survive, but never again as sovereigns. Today, traces of this dynasty endure in folklore, songs, ruins hidden in the Semien Mountains, and the proud memory of a people who once had kings, Jewish kings in Africa, ruling a forgotten highland kingdom long before the world was ready to believe it. It may sound like a myth, but it's not. Around 985 CE, a fleet of longships cut through the icy winds of the Atlantic, carrying Norse settlers from Iceland to a land that they called Greenland, or Greenland. Led by Eric the Red, a man banished for murder and driven by the desire for a fresh start, they discovered fords, abundant fish, and lush summer meadows that tempted others to follow. And follow they did, hundreds of them. For centuries, Norse farmers had lived in Greenland. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, built turf longhouses, churches, and even a cathedral, and sent walrus ivory and furs back to Europe. For a time, they thrived. Two major settlements, the eastern and western, numbered as many as 2,500 people at their peaks. Then, they vanished. By the early 15th century, the western settlement had fallen silent, and a century later, the eastern settlement was gone as well. When a Danish missionary arrived in 1721, he found only Inuit hunters. No Norse, no descendants, only ruins. Climate here is the obvious culprit. The so-called Little Ice Age began in the 14th century. Winters grew colder and colder, pasture land withered, and sea ice made trade with Europe increasingly perilous. Yet cold alone does not fully explain the collapse. There's evidence of isolation. As trade declined, so did access to iron, grain, and luxuries, making contact with Europe increasingly rare. Meanwhile, the Inuit, already adapted to Greenland's harsher edges, were flourishing. Yet there's little to no sign that the Norse ever embraced the Inuit survival techniques. No dog sleds, no seal hunting kayaks. They clung to European ways, even as those methods simply stopped working. Some archaeologists suspect starvation played a role, while others suggest disease. There are also signs of violence, broken bones, hastily buried bodies. Still, some argue that the Norse simply left, giving up and fleeing Iceland or back to Norway. But if they did depart, why is there no record? Why have no stories been passed down? Their churches still stand in ruin, with stone walls half swallowed by tundra and graveyards where bones lie stiff under frost. It's as if they didn't just die. They deliberately gave up being remembered. The last written record? Well, that was a wedding in Havalsi Church in 1408. After that, there is nothing. The Greenland Norse were once on the edge of Christendom, proud, stubborn settlers clinging to survival on the rim of the world. But then the wind changed, and they were gone. In the dusty hills near Dawa, half buried in scrub and stone, lie the remains of a forgotten people. There are massive walls, stone houses, strange coins, and mosques carved from rock. Locals call them the City of Giants, the last remnant of the Harla. Yet history remembers them only in fragments, and even those fragments are fading. The Harla Kingdom rose sometime between the 6th and 15th centuries, though dating it precisely has proven difficult. What we do know comes from a mix of ruins and lingering rumour. They were master builders, skilled stonemasons who erected settlements without the aid of mortar. They finally fitted their blocks together with an uncanny precision. They were Muslim, with some suggesting that they were among the earliest in East Africa to embrace Islam. Their cities boasted mosques, trade routes, and bustling workshops. And they were connected. Artifacts from India, Persia, and even China have been discovered among their ruins. Ceramics, beads, foreign coins. The Harla were not isolated mountain people. They were part of a broader Indian Ocean network where merchants crossed deserts and seas, bringing salt, spices, silk, and stories. Then, somewhere between the 15th and 16th centuries, they disappeared. No war was recorded. No fire left a scar. The people simply left or were lost. Local folklore offers various explanations. Some say the Harla were giants themselves, cast down by divine punishment, while others believe they were driven away by invading tribes, swallowed by the rise of new Muslim sultanates and the eventual expansion of the Oromo people. There's another possibility. They didn't vanish. They were absorbed, changed, and blended into the surrounding culture so thoroughly that no trace of their distinct identity remains. Yet the silence remains unsettling. For a civilization with trade connections spanning continents, no writing was left behind, no chronicles, no lists of rulers, only stone. Their buildings still stand, half crumbled and overtaken by time and dust. Nearby farmers plough fields scattered with broken pottery, while children play among the ruins, watched over by jackals and shifting shadows. The elders still speak of the Jards, the Harla, who could lift stones that no one today can move. Yet when archaeologists ask for details, the stories begin to shift. Memory bleeds into myth, and facts grow hazy. The Harla stand as proof that even in an era of trade and religion, a kingdom could quietly vanish without a grand finale, leaving only ruins and lingering questions. High in the Sierra Nevada to Santa Marta in Colombia, where the jungle clings to jagged cliffs and mists curl through ancient trees, lie the remnants of a people who built cities above the clouds, the Tairona. They left behind no written records, no towering monuments, but what they did leave is nothing short of astonishing. Their cities were not built with palaces or pyramids. Instead, they were carved directly into the mountains, stone terraces that curved gracefully, encircled by steps and winding pathways like veins across the slopes. The most famous of these, Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, was only rediscovered in the 1970s, having been swallowed by the jungle for centuries. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, the Tairona had already developed an intricate society. They constructed roads, farmed the steep hillsides using sophisticated terracing techniques, traded along the coast, and crafted gold jewelry of extraordinary detail and spiritual symbolism. Their artisans were revered, and their culture was deeply intertwined with nature, the cycles of life, and sacred geography. They lived in a delicate balance with the mountains, the rivers, and the stars. But then something happened. As the Spanish pushed inland, lured by rumors of gold, they encountered fierce resistance. The Tairona didn't surrender without a fight. They resisted, ambushing, retreating, and ultimately fleeing deeper into the mountains, disappearing into lands where few outsiders could endure. By the late 1600s, the Spanish had crushed nearly all visible resistance. The coastal settlements were dismantled, the gold was taken, and the Tairona, well, they were gone. Or so it appeared. Their cities crumbled under creeping vines, their roads were forgotten, and their names vanished from colonial records. Yet the people, at least some, did remain. Today their descendants still live in the Sierra, the Kogi, the Ahuaco, and the Wiwa. They speak languages rooted in Tairona traditions. They wear white as a sacred symbol of peace, and they see themselves as caretakers of the earth, elder brothers to the rest of us who have forgotten how to live in harmony. They seldom speak of Ciudad Perdida, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence. To them, it is not a tourist site, it is a sacred place. It's their heartbeat. So did the Tairona disappear? Well, not exactly. Their world, what they built, what they believed, and the way they lived was buried by force, by time, by trees, by silence. The jungle took them in. Before the tourists, before colonial flags, and even before maps bothered to label the scattered outposts in the Atlantic, there were the Guanches, the original inhabitants of the Canary Islands. Mysterious, isolated, and resilient, they lived on those rugged volcanic rocks for over 1,000 years, only to vanish in what seemed like a blink of history. When the Spanish arrived in the 15th century, they were stunned. Here, hundreds of miles from mainland Europe or Africa, they encountered tall, light-skinned people living in stone huts and caves, draped in goat skins, raising livestock, and even mummifying their dead. Some described them with fascination, while others expressed confusion. Who were they? How had they come here? To this day, we don't fully know. Some scholars believe that the Guanches were of Berber origin, having arrived from North Africa centuries or perhaps even millennia earlier. But how? The islands had no boats or boat-building traditions. Once they arrived, However they did, they stayed, isolated from the rest of the world. Generation after generation grew up with nothing but the sea, the sky, and stone. They developed their own unique rhythms, dialects, and gods. They farmed barley and herded goats, stored food in granaries carved into cliffs, and built mysterious step pyramids aligned with the stars. They honored their dead with meticulous burial rites and spoke a language so distinct that it is now mostly extinct, surviving only in fragments. And then the ships arrived. The Spanish conquest that began in the early 1400s. Island by island, the Guanches resisted fiercely and desperately. On Tenerife, they fought to the death. They hurled boulders from cliffs and waged guerrilla warfare in ravines and forests. Yet their stone tools and unwavering courage could not withstand the force of steel, muskets, and cavalry. By 1496, the conquest was complete. The survivors were enslaved, converted, and assimilated. Some fled into the highlands, vanishing from sight forever. Others merged into mixed bloodlines, their distinct identity gradually erased with every new generation. Today, Guanche blood still flows in Canarian veins, as DNA studies have confirmed, but their culture, their unique worldview, their language, and the memory of how they interpreted the cosmos has faded. They left behind petroglyphs, mummies, and caves as traces of what once was, but not a single surviving voice. What makes the Guanches so haunting is how little remains of them. They lived, they fought, and they vanished. A civilization cut off from the world only to be consumed by it. They were the first people Europeans encountered in Newfoundland, and the first to disappear. The Bearthug lived along the rocky coasts and inland rivers of present-day Newfoundland for centuries, perhaps even millennia. They fished the cold Atlantic waters, hunted caribou across the tundra, and paddled birch-bark canoes through glassy inlets. Their world was built on movement, memory, and red ochre. That last element there, that's definitely key. They painted everything with the vibrant substance, tools, clothing, their bodies, even the dead. The ochre gave their skin a reddish tint, leading early European explorers to mistakenly call them Red Indians. Yet the ochre was more than just paint. It carried deep spiritual meaning, a connection to the ancestors and a shield against the harsh forces of the world. And once again, then came the ships. Vikings may have been the first to encounter them, albeit briefly and violently, but it was the Basque, French, and English who stayed. They fished the Grand Banks, established outposts, and regarded the Bearthug not as neighbors, but as nuisances. The Bearthug refused to trade and avoided being drawn into the colonial orbit, so they withdrew. As settlers gradually took over the coast, the Bearthug retreated inland and then further inland, until there was simply nowhere left to go. And conflict ensued, not as open warfare, but as a slow, steady erosion of their way of life. Fishing grounds disappeared, caribou routes were blocked, and traps were destroyed. Acts of retaliation spiraled, leading to starvation, disease, and increasing fear. By the early 19th century, their population had dwindled to a whisper. The last known Bearthug was a woman named Shana Wadit. Captured in 1823, she lived with settlers for 6 years, drawing maps and recounting her people's history before ultimately succumbing to tuberculosis in 1829. With her death, the Bearthug were declared extinct. Not conquered, not assimilated, extinct. Today, their memory endures in fragments, stone tools discovered beside rivers, place names that echo their lost language, and the silent dedication of indigenous activists striving to reclaim what remains. DNA studies even suggest that Bearthug ancestry may persist in other tribes, such as the Mi'kmaq, though no direct cultural continuity survives. They were few in number and left no written record, yet they were a people who chose separateness and paid dearly for that choice. Along the sun-bleached coast of southern Turkey, where turquoise waters meet ancient cliffs, tombs are carved high into the rock face. Some resemble temples, others echo wooden houses frozen in time, set in limestone. These are the graves of the Lycians, a people both bold and elusive living on the edge of myth and empire. They didn't build pyramids or raise palaces, they carved their legacy into stone. The cliffs of Myra, the necropolises of Xanthos, and towering sarcophagi that sit like ancient sentinels across hillsides. Each monument speaks of a culture that saw death not as an end, but as another journey, a gateway to something beyond. The Lycians first emerged around 1200 BCE, known to the Hittites as the Laka people, and even mentioned in Egyptian texts, perhaps among the enigmatic sea peoples. Yet it was only in the Classical Age that their unique identity truly began to shine. They were seafarers, traders, and fiercely independent. Unlike most of their neighbors, the Lycians practiced a form of confederated democracy. Over 24 cities each wielded a vote in the Central Lycian League, with larger cities carrying more influence. Their system was so highly regarded that even the framers of the US Constitution studied it. They also had their own language, Lycian, etched into stone steels and bilingual inscriptions. This language was a blend of Greek and older Anatolian roots, still only partially understood today. Yet, despite their autonomy, the Lycians lived in a dangerous neighborhood. They were courted, conquered, and coerced by larger powers. First the Persians, then the Athenians, and finally Alexander the Great. They resisted when they could, but slowly and steadily they were pulled under the tide of history. Their fall didn't come with fire or plague. It occurred through slow erosion, assimilation, and Hellenization. By the time Rome arrived, Lycian culture had blurred into Greek form. The language faded, the league persisted for a while longer, and then was absorbed. Their cities became Roman provinces. Their tombs remained, but their voices were silent. Today, hikers wander the Lycian Way, a long-distance trail that snakes past crumbled theaters, vine-choked ruins, and empty tombs with open doors. There's a beauty in that silence. There's also something else. There's a feeling that persists, that an entire civilization watches from the cliffs, quiet, but half-remembered. The Lycians were not erased. They were overwritten. Before Persia existed, before Cyrus, Darius, and the splendor of Persepolis, there was Elam. Nestled in the far southwest of what is now modern Iran, Elam was ancient even by Mesopotamian standards. While the Sumerians began constructing their first ziggurats, the Elamites were already carving statues and writing in a unique script that no one else used. They lay just beyond the Euphrates frontier, neighbors, occasional rivals, and sometimes conquerors. Over time, however, they faded into the annals of history, absorbed by greater empires. Yet, they were never minor players. Their cities, Susa and Anshan, were grand and fortified, teeming with temples. Their gods were peculiar, rooted in local tradition and wielding great power. Their language was a linguistic orphan, unrelated to any known tongue. Even today, Elamite stands apart from the Indo-European and Semitic families that came to dominate the ancient world. It remains a dead end, or perhaps a lost branch in the evolution of language. The Elamites had their own writing system, a linear Elamite that still hasn't been fully deciphered. Much of what we know about them comes from their enemies: Akkadian records, Babylonian boasts, Assyrian propaganda. Yet time and again, the Elamites appear in the margins, resisting, raiding, rebuilding. They even sacked Babylon at least once, seizing the sacred statue of Marduk and marching it back to Susa as a prize. But they were more than mere warriors. They were engineers, they were builders. They were artisans. Their art was delicate, their jewelry intricate, their pottery refined. They were ruled by kings and queens, with some periods of joint reigns. Powerful women repeatedly emerge in Elamite inscriptions, a rarity for that era. Like so many early civilizations, however, Elam did not fall abruptly. It gradually unraveled. Pressure first came from the Assyrians in the west, and then from the Medes in the north. By the 6th century BCE, the rise of the new Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great swept Elam into its orbit. Susa, once an Elamite city, became a Persian capital. The old language lingered for a while before disappearing. The gods were forgotten. The scribes eventually stopped writing. No myths have kept their name alive, and no grand epics have preserved their deeds. Only fragments, clay tablets, and ruined palaces endure. Names like Shutruk, Nakhunte, once feared across Mesopotamia, now live only in the shadowy corners of dusty museums. Yet if you wander among the ruins of Susa, you'll notice distinct layers: an Elamite foundation, overlaid by Persian then Islamic, and finally modern dust like echoes buried beneath echoes. The Elamites didn't simply vanish. They were absorbed and interred within the narratives of those who followed, rewritten by the victors. They never ruled empires or built pyramids, yet for centuries the Sogdians held the ancient world together as an essential cultural glue. From the 4th to the 10th century CE, they dominated the Silk Road, not through armies, but through trade, language, and diplomacy. Their cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjakent, were vibrant oases of culture emerging among the deserts and valleys of today's Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. These centers of color, movement, and conversation were where Persians met Chinese, Indians encountered Greeks, and strangers transformed into neighbors over dates and tea. They were merchants, yeah, but they were so much more. They were translators, storytellers, ambassadors. When Chinese monks journeyed west in search of Buddhist scriptures, they hired Sogdians as guides. When caravans traversed mountains and deserts, it was the Sogdian traders who led the way. They knew every shortcut, every dialect, and every deity deserving a quick prayer before crossing a treacherous path. Their language, an Eastern Iranian tongue, became the lingua franca of the Silk Road. Not Chinese, not Arabic, but Sogdian. And they weren't merely intermediaries. They had style. Wall paintings in the ruins of Sogdian homes reveal elegant banquets, musicians, dancers, and gods adorned with golden halos. They penned letters in a flowing script, some of which have survived the desert sands, fragments of heartbreak, invoices, and diplomacy. Their belief system was a blend of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and Christianity. Just a little bit of everything, a fluid thing rather than something rigid. Yet they lived between giants. To the east lay Tang China, to the west the Islamic Caliphates, and to the north nomadic tribes that swept down like storms. For a time the Sogdians thrived by navigating these powerful forces, paying tribute to some, trading with others, and bending without breaking. Until they couldn't. In the 8th century, Arab expansion reached Central Asia. Islam spread rapidly, often through trade and at times by the sword. Sogdian culture, long rooted in older religions, began to erode. Their cities fell to new rulers, their temples were torn down, and Arabic eventually replaced their scripts. Some Sogdians fled to China, serving as officials and merchants, while others remained to blend into the evolving cultural tapestry. By the 10th century, the name Sogdian had all but vanished. Their language had faded, and their faiths disappeared. Yet if you walk the Silk Road today, stand amid the ruins of Panjakent, or trace the ancient caravan routes across the steppe, you can still feel that hum. The echo of a world that once connected continents not by conquest, but through conversation. Imagine sand. Endless sand, parched, cracked earth, no rivers, no forests, just the Sahara, relentless, vast and ancient. Now imagine a city emerging in this landscape, not just one, but dozens. Picture underground canals, multi-story homes, and lush gardens concealed behind high walls. This is not a mirage, it's a fascinating reality. This was the world of the Garamantes. They inhabited what is now southwestern Libya in the Fezzan region. For centuries, Roman writers dismissed them as desert barbarians, nomads on chariots, raiders with wild hair and uncanny speed. Yet the truth, buried beneath layers of sand and centuries of misconception, is far stranger. The Garamantes, it turns out, were not nomads. They were urban dwellers. Their cities, actual cities, date back as early as 500 BCE. At their peak, at around 100 CE, these urban centers supported tens of thousands of people, all in the heart of the Sahara. But how's that possible? And the answer, of course, is water. The Garamantes engineered vagaras, ingenious underground irrigation tunnels that channeled water from fossil aquifers hidden deep beneath the desert. These were no simple trenches. They were complex, hand-dug systems stretching across kilometers of rock and sand. This network allowed them to farm in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They cultivated date palms, barley, and wheat, and a whole lot more. They engaged in trade with Rome, Egypt, and sub-Saharan Africa. Their caravans traversed vast stretches of desert, transporting salt, slaves, gold, and ideas. They built mud brick homes, burial mounds, temples, tombs, and even roads connecting isolated desert settlements. But eventually, the wells ran dry. By the 5th century CE, the fossil water had dwindled and the vagaras collapsed. The climate shifted, hotter and drier, and the land they had tamed began to reclaim itself. Trade routes moved, Roman influence vanished, and the desert, slowly and without mercy, swallowed them whole. The Garamantes didn't disappear in a blaze of glory, but rather in a slow, silent retreat. Centuries later, when explorers and archaeologists stumbled upon their ruins, they were stunned. Urban remains emerged in the heart of the Sahara. Cemeteries stretched as far as the eye could see, and irrigation tunnels still stood intact in some areas. It was the legacy of a civilization that had defied its landscape, only to ultimately succumb to it. Perhaps that's what makes them so haunting. They didn't fall to war or to plague. They fell to thirst. Here was a people who carved life from the driest soil on earth, only to vanish when the water beneath their feet ran out. In the fertile Sichuan basin of southwest China, something startling was unearthed in the 1980s, lying hidden beneath layers of earth and time. It wasn't a city, it wasn't a tomb, it was a hoard. Pits filled with gold masks, towering bronze statues, jade blades, elephant tusks, and a collection of faces so bizarre and unlike anything seen in Chinese art, which left even seasoned archaeologists utterly stunned. Eyes widened, ears caught every sound, expressions seemed frozen in an eternal, mysterious ritual. This was Sanxingdui, a civilization that does not appear in ancient Chinese histories, one that built no known walls or palaces and left no written records. But it was a society that flourished around 1200 BCE, perhaps even earlier. It ran parallel to the Shang dynasty, long hailed as the cradle of Chinese civilization. But Sanxingdui wasn't Shang, it was something entirely different. The bronzes they left behind defy expectation. Some exceed 2 meters in height, crafted with astonishing skill and cast as one seamless piece. These weren't utilitarian objects. They were ceremonial, spiritual offerings to gods, ancestors, and perhaps even forces we've yet to understand. 2 sacrificial pits were discovered, filled with relics that had been deliberately smashed and buried, not in chaotic abandonment, but in a ritualistic manner. It was as if the people of Sanxingdui were marking the end of something, signaling a shift, or even concealing a secret. And then, there was nothing. After a few centuries, Sanxingdui vanished from the archaeological record. Their bronze work disappeared, and their city, if it ever existed in the traditional sense, was abandoned as the culture dissolved. So where did they go? Well, some believe they migrated west or merged with the Ba people, ancestors of the Shu Kingdom. Others suggest a catastrophic earthquake or flood diverted the Min River, cutting off water and forcing a retreat. It could have been a political collapse or even a spiritual reckoning. The artifacts remained buried for over 3,000 years. And here's the thing. When they emerged, they didn't quite fit the conventional narrative. Sanxingdui's art doesn't look Chinese. It's otherworldly, grotesque, and magnificent, like something from an entirely different tradition. And yet it existed within the borders of China, emerging at the same time as the dynasties whose influence is etched deep into the country's identity. They were advanced, distinct, and long forgotten. Today their relics are proudly displayed in gleaming museums, drawing crowds and prompting questions. But the people behind them, their names, stories, and reasons for creation remain elusive. Far from Peru's sun-baked deserts, tucked among the steep slopes and swirling clouds of the Amazon's western edge, a hidden kingdom once clung to the cliffs. The Chachapoya. They didn't build with gold, and they weren't as vast as the Inca, but what they left behind, burial towers, mountaintop citadels, and walls etched with haunting faces, is both eerie and extraordinary. Their name wasn't their own. Chachapoya comes from the Inca, who called them the Sachapore, people of the forest, or more dramatically, the warriors of the clouds. They lived along the cloud line in remote, nearly vertical terrain, forests thick with orchids, vines, and silence. Hard to reach, even harder to conquer. But eventually, the Inca tried. Before that, the Chachapoya had thrived for centuries, perhaps for over 1,000 years. They built stone cities without mortar, creating round houses clustered together, often on ridges with commanding views. Their finest achievement, Kulap, sits over 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet above sea level. Sometimes called the Machu Picchu of the North, its walls rise up to 20 meters or 65 feet high, encircling hundreds of structures. Unlike the Inca, however, the Chachapoya favored rounded forms, and their buildings feature spiral patterns and zigzags, artistic touches that remain a mystery to this day. And then there are the dead. The Chachapoya buried their ancestors in cliffside tombs, literally wedging sarcophagi into sheer rock faces high above river gorges. The mummies were wrapped, posed, and left to watch over the world below. Some of these tombs remain nearly inaccessible today. How they managed to place them there remains a mystery. But even a world hidden among clouds couldn't stay concealed forever. In the 15th century, the Inca arrived, determined to bring the region under their control. The Chachapoya fiercely resisted. There were revolts, retreats, and brutal reprisals. Eventually, they were subdued, but they weren't completely conquered. When the Spanish arrived, decades later, the Chachapoya seized the opportunity and sided with the newcomers against their former Inca overlords. That didn't end well. Disease swept through the Andes, smallpox, measles, influenza, ravaging communities before a sword was ever drawn. By the 17th century, most of the Chachapoya were gone, assimilated, killed, forgotten. Their ruins lay hidden for centuries, swallowed by fog and forest. Their language is lost. Their stories too. Yet when you stand in Kulab, the wind whipping over ancient stones, or catch sight of a sarcophagus peering from a cliffside niche, you feel the weight of something left unsaid, a civilization balanced between sky and earth. Before Assyria fell and Persia rose, a kingdom called Urartu ruled the mountains surrounding Lake Van. For a time, it was a fortress of gods. From the 9th to the 6th century BCE, Urartu etched itself into the very bones of the land. Fortresses perched on sheer cliffs, temples carved from basalt, and aqueducts winding through deep valleys. It was a realm of stone and thunder, ruled by kings who believed their authority descended directly from the heavens. They worshipped Haldi, the supreme god of war and sky, often depicted standing atop a lion. His temples loomed over their capitals, especially Tushpa, the royal city set on the lake's edge. Every victory, every monumental building, and every engineering marvel was dedicated to the gods through inscriptions that have survived to this day, written in a language related to Hurrian, an ancient tongue seemingly older than time itself. Urartian society was rigid, militarized, and centralized. The state ran the show. The Urartians were expert metallurgists and engineers, their irrigation canals still existing in parts of modern Armenia and Turkey, and water still flows where Urartian hands once dug. They tamed mountains, they defied the terrain. Yet for all their strength, they were surrounded by wolves. Assyria lay to the south, the Scythians to the north, and the Medes closed in from the east. By the late 7th century BCE, the pressures mounted. The capital moved eastward, fortresses were overrun, inscriptions ceased, and the gods grew silent. And then, once again, there was nothing. No final battle is recorded, no grand collapse was etched in fire. There's just silence, as if the kingdom simply folded into the hills and allowed the snow to cover it. Most agree that the Medes, an Indo-Iranian people rising to power, dealt the final blow. Whether through conquest or gradual absorption, the Urartians eventually faded and their name disappeared. Yet their legacy was not completely lost. In fact, their memory may have lived on under a different name, Ararat, the biblical mountain. Some Armenian traditions even claim a direct lineage from the Urartians, asserting descent from this vanished kingdom. Today, their ruins remain, towering walls on mountain ridges, inscriptions half buried in dust, and forgotten canals still guiding water through dry plains. But yet, few know their name. Urartu is one of those kingdoms that shaped the world from the shadows, feared by its neighbors, overlooked by history, and only recently rediscovered by archaeologists and the poets of stone. They once ruled from the heights, only to vanish into them. After Charlemagne's death in the 9th century, his sprawling empire was carved like a roast among feuding heirs. From that messy feast emerged a kingdom that few remember today, yet one that left its fingerprints across half of Europe. Lotharingia, named after Lothar II, Charlemagne's grandson, was never intended to be permanent. It was a narrow strip of land wedged awkwardly between West Francia, which would become France, and East Francia, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, stretching from the North Sea down to northern Italy. The kingdom encompassed regions of what are now the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Lorraine, Western Germany, and parts of Switzerland. It was massive, it was wealthy, and it was unstable. Lothar II didn't inherit the land through conquest, but through compromise. Born amid the swirling chaos of the Carolingian civil wars, he became king of a realm stitched together from leftovers. He ruled from Aachen and Metz, relying on a delicate balance of nobles, bishops, and relatives, and spent most of his reign battling to divorce his wife. That scandal not only consumed his court, but also drew in the Pope, weakening his rule. When he died in 869 without a legitimate heir, the vultures descended. West and East Francia divided Lotharingia between themselves, tearing it in two. Yet the name endured. For centuries, Lotharingia, or Lorraine, remained in use, not as a kingdom, but as a contested zone, a tug-of-war ground between France and Germany. Towns changed hands, languages shifted, and borders blurred. The region evolved into a crucible of European identity, warfare, and diplomacy. Even today, it lingers. In the region of Lorraine, France, lies Lotharingia, the kingdom whose name gave birth to the term Low Countries in its northern provinces. Many of the conflicts that later defined Franco-German relations, including World War I and World War II, were fought on the very lands where Lothar once ruled. Yet the kingdom itself vanished in only 15 short years. There was no final battle, no burning capital, only political missteps, dynastic ambitions, and a map redrawn by those who cared little for memory. Lotharingia is the kingdom that disappeared, but never truly left. Its name remains caught between giants, its legacy stitched into modern borders, serving as a reminder that sometimes even the most fleeting realms can shape future centuries, not through glory, but through geography. For centuries, it existed as little more than a whisper in Chinese texts, Shu. This kingdom was said to lie to the west, beyond mountains and rivers, in a land perpetually shrouded in clouds. The records are vague, and Shu soon became mythic. Some even believed it was nothing more than a metaphor, a poetic invention meant to evoke mystery and wonder. Then, the earth cracked open, and that story changed. In the 1980s, in a quiet corner of Sichuan province, farmers digging for a water reservoir made an unexpected discovery. They didn't find pottery or coins. Instead, they uncovered a pit filled with gold, jade, and bronze, materials that didn't match any known dynasty. Out emerged human-like figures with bulging eyes, towering masks adorned with curled tusks, and life-size trees cast in bronze. The site soon became known as Sangxingdui. But this wasn't an isolated culture. These were the people of Shu. The Shu Kingdom thrived during China's Bronze Age, from roughly the 12th to the 7th century BCE. According to ancient legends, their capital was a city called Langzhong, or Guangdu, though it's never actually been found. What archaeologists did uncover were elaborate sacrificial pits layered with ash and burnt offerings, brimming with artworks unlike anything in Han Chinese tradition. Their bronzes were peculiar, surreal, almost alien, with elongated faces, wide eyes, and stylized animals. These pieces were not tools of empire or conquest. They were ceremonial expressions of belief systems that we still don't fully understand. Shu was unique in its distinct departure from the heart of China. It did not share in the traditions of the Shang or the Zhou. Instead, it boasted its own pantheon and symbols. Shu was a parallel world, developing spiritually, isolated by the mountains surrounding the Sichuan Basin. And then, once again, it disappeared. No single explanation accounts for its vanishing. Some argue that an internal collapse led to the Shu's downfall, while others point to the expansion of the Zhou dynasty, which might have absorbed it or even destroyed it. Another theory suggests that natural disasters, a flood, famine, or earthquake, could have sealed its fate. Whatever the cause, by the 4th century BCE, Shu was no longer a kingdom. Its culture had been absorbed into larger imperial frameworks, and its memory faded into myth. Until the soil returned its secrets. Today, new discoveries continue to emerge. Most recently, another Sangxingdui pit was unearthed. Each new layer reveals more questions, though. Who were the gods of Shu? Why were treasures buried in fire and ash? And why did its people leave behind no written words? To the ancient Egyptians, it was known as the land of the gods. Punt was not only a trading partner, a place of wealth, wonder, and deep reverence, but also a realm shrouded in mystery. Despite its importance, its exact location remains unknown. Egyptian references to Punt appear in records over 4,000 years old. Expeditions, often launched by Old Kingdom pharaohs, set out on voyages that sometimes lasted months or even years. They returned bearing treasures: ebony, ivory, leopard skins, electrum, baboons, and a variety of incense, with myrrh being particularly prized. One pharaoh even went so far as to plant entire groves of incense trees in temple courtyards in an effort to recapture the fragrance of Punt. This practice reveals something crucial. Punt was much more than a hub of commerce. It was sacred. The most celebrated expedition was undertaken by Queen Hatshepsut around 1470 BCE. Her temple at Deir el-Baghari is adorned with carved scenes depicting ships laden with treasure, men with beards, unusual stilt houses, and a queen of Punt portrayed holding rolls of fat, a possible symbol of wealth or health. These images stand among the oldest surviving records of African diplomacy. But here's the mystery. We still don't know where Punt was. The Egyptians left us no map, only vague descriptions like to the south, or across the sea, or beyond the land of incense. Helpful. Some scholars place it at what is now Eritrea or Somalia, others suggest it could be in Sudan or even southern Arabia. A few have even proposed that Punt wasn't fixed at all, instead representing a shifting network of trade cities over time rather than a single kingdom. Yeah, the goods from Punt were real, the journeys truly happened, the reverence the Egyptians held was genuine. So, what happened to it? Well, that's the second mystery. Punt disappears from Egyptian records sometime around the end of the New Kingdom, roughly 1000 BC. Whether this disappearance was due to political lapse, climate change, shifting trade routes, or foreign invasion, that remains unknown. It just fades away. No confirmed ruins, no inscriptions in supposed Puntite script, no surviving oral tradition that decisively claims its legacy. It was there, and then it wasn't. Some archaeologists now believe we're getting close. Rock art, the DNA of mummified baboons traced to Eritrea, and ancient harbour sites along the Red Sea are all tightening the circle. Yet there's still no firm answer, no capital uncovered, no city to anchor the legend. And that is precisely what makes Punt so haunting. In ancient times, Egypt called it the land of the gods, the source of sacred incense, a place of peace and plenty. Today it remains elusive, somewhere out there, waiting in the sands or hidden beneath jungle canopy, clutching its name and offering no address. The kingdom of Punt did not vanish in a blaze of war, it disappeared into the mists. It is a civilization known only through the stories told by others. Long before the great kingdoms of West Africa, before the Benin bronzes and the golden walls of Mali, there were the Nok. Buried beneath the dusty plateaus of central Nigeria, an ancient culture emerged quietly around 1500 BCE. For a civilization so old, its discovery was almost accidental. In the 1920s, miners digging for tin unearthed something strange: a human head sculpted in terracotta, characterized by almond-shaped eyes and delicate, intricate detail. More figures soon followed, dozens, even hundreds. Each one is different, each one powerful. This was Nok. It was the oldest known civilization in sub-Saharan Africa to have smelted iron, and among the earliest to produce such sophisticated art. They carved their legacy not in stone or in the formation of vast empires, but it was fired in clay. Their figures are truly remarkable. Some portray warriors, while others depict musicians, dancers, and children. Many sit calmly with folded hands, exuding an air of quiet strength. Each sculpture seems to tell a story, even as it speaks in a language that we no longer understand. The Nok left behind no writing, no cities that have been found, and no recorded myths or names of kings. What we know comes solely from the earth. Terracotta fragments, iron tools, pottery shards. Yet even these remnants whisper of a people who were highly organized, skilled in metalwork, artistry, and agriculture. They raised livestock and farmed millet and sorghum, living in village clusters that were possibly connected by trade. They also developed iron smelting technology independently, or perhaps even before many others on the continent, a breakthrough that reshaped the region. Then, sometime around 300 CE, it all came to an end. The Nok culture simply vanished. No one knows why. Some believe environmental degradation played a role, deforestation, soil exhaustion, and drought, while others suspect internal decline or external pressure. Yet, there is no direct evidence of war or a dramatic collapse. The art abruptly ceases, the iron grows cold, and the settlements fade away. For nearly 1,500 years, their existence went completely unnoticed. It wasn't until the 20th century that the Nok re-emerged in human memory. Even now, that memory remains patchy. Many early finds were looted, sold to collectors, and stripped of context. Some pieces sit in museums with lost provenance, their stories reduced to mere curiosities. But their faces endure. Each sculpture and expression feels unnervingly alive, as if the Nok are still watching us, still waiting to be understood. They left behind no temples, no scrolls, only far-hardened earth, patiently shaped by skilled hands. In the steep valleys of Sichuan and Yunnan, far removed from modern China's neon cities and roaring highways, strange wooden coffins cling to rock faces suspended hundreds of feet above the ground. Some rest on wooden beams, driven into sheer cliff walls, while others balance in natural crevices exposed to wind and the passage of time. No ropes, no ladders, just air and silence. These are the hanging coffins of the Bo people. For centuries, locals have wondered who they were. No one alive remembered them anymore. The cliffside tombs, some rotted, others remarkably intact, stood as eerie sentinels. The Bo themselves had become little more than a name, a whisper, yet they were real. Long before the Qing dynasty unified the region, these lush, rugged landscapes were home to a people known as the Bo, a tribal community distinct in language, culture, and belief, who carved wooden coffins bearing human faces and placed them high enough where no enemy, animal, or flood could reach. Elevation for them was sacred. The higher the resting place, the closer the departed was to the spirit world. And these were no small funerals. Some coffins weighed hundreds of kilograms, and many were once adorned with bright paints. How the Bo managed to elevate such heavy and intricately designed coffins, that remains a matter of debate. Rope systems, scaffolding, whatever their methods though, the process was both precise and incredibly dangerous. Yet across gorges and mountains, they repeated this practice site after site. Eventually, the Bo were wiped out sometime between the 14th and the 17th centuries. Some sources suggest that they resisted Ming expansion and ultimately paid the price. Others imply they were overwhelmed by the relentless push of empires and assimilation. Their villages were buried, their names erased, their traditions banned, a deliberate attempt at collective forgetting. By the time Chinese historians and archaeologists arrived centuries later, the Bo had no living descendants, at least not in name. Their language was lost, their stories vanished, and all that remained were the coffins, staring out over the river and forest like wooden question marks. There's something deeply human in that defiance. They didn't build cities or wage conquests, yet they placed their dead where even gravity seemed to yield. They believed in height, in remembrance, in resting above the world. Even now, as clouds coil around the cliffs and birds pass in silent flight, the Bo remain unseen, yet ever present. High upon the plateaus of central Peru, in lands with brittle air and jagged peaks, lies the ruins of a once mighty civilization. Here, massive walls, stone corridors, and silent plazas testify to an empire that predated the Inca, who later wove their realm together with roads and gold. The Wari had already built their own vast empire. And then they disappeared. The Wari emerged around 500 CE, at a time when the great coastal cultures like the Moche and Nazca were beginning to fade. Their capital, located near present-day Ayacucho, sat high in the mountains at more than 2,800 meters above sea level. From this vantage point, they expanded their influence not solely through brute conquest, but via infrastructure diplomacy and a practice that the Inca would later perfect: the construction of roads. Their road network connected highland centers with coastal outposts and linked valleys to mountaintops. Along these routes, they constructed way stations, temples, and warehouses. Their cities were planned with grid-like precision, an uncommon feature in pre-Columbian America, and their architecture was modular, rectangular compounds arranged like puzzle pieces. The Wari also demonstrated remarkable mastery over their environment. They understood the challenges of drought, engineering reservoirs and practicing terracing. Their control over food and water was not merely a matter of practicality, it was a tool of political power. Yet what truly distinguished the Wari was their culture. Their art is vivid, geometric, and often unsettling. Boldly woven textiles feature figures both human and animal, sacred and surreal. Their ceramics, crafted with fierce stylized faces, add to the intrigue. And perhaps most curiously, the treatment of their dead further sets them apart. In the Wari city of Contrampata, archaeologists discovered skulls arranged deliberately, some elongated, others bearing drill holes, and even a few painted. Was this a ritual, a medical practice, or perhaps they were war trophies? In Wari life, the line between religion and governance was thin, if it existed at all. For centuries, the Wari ruled a swath of the Andes as expansive as any that came before. Then, around 1000 CE, it all began to unravel. There, again, was no grand invasion, no clearly defined cataclysm. There was just slow fragmentation. Climate may have played a role, with droughts and food shortages emerging over time. There's also evidence of civil unrest. Cities became fortified and elites retreated into their compounds. Whatever the cause, the Wari centers were abandoned one by one. Their political structure dissolved, leaving roads that ultimately led to silence. Yet the influence of the Wari lingered. Centuries later, when the Inca began building their empire, they adopted much more than just the highland roads. They built upon Wari foundations, politically, architecturally, and culturally. The echo of their legacy is still evident today. But the Wari themselves? They left no name for us, no chronicles, no myths, just stones, threads, and hints. They ruled before the Incas, and then they vanished, without a trace. Long before Rome, before Athens, and even before the pyramids took shape in a pharaoh's mind, there was Vincha. This was Neolithic Europe, around 1500 BCE, near what is now modern Belgrade, where a strange and startling civilization emerged. It spread through the Danube basin to Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and beyond, not as a scattering of isolated huts, but as large, organized settlements, among the largest on Earth at the time. People here lived in homes equipped with ovens and wooden furniture. They crafted pottery with swirling patterns and fired clay figurines, some abstract, others eerily lifelike, with staring eyes and elongated heads. Their settlements were carefully planned and rebuilt upon themselves, layer after layer. But what truly sets Vincha apart is what they left behind. Symbols. Etched into pottery, carved into figurines, pressed into wet clay, rows of signs appear across their artifacts. There are over 700 distinct marks, straight lines, zigzags, crosses, and swirls. Some of these marks repeat, some stand alone, and many are arranged in sequences. And to this day, we haven't discovered what they mean. Some scholars believe these marks represent the oldest known form of proto-writing, predating Sumerian cuneiform by nearly 2,000 years. Others contend that they're merely decorative, mnemonic, or ritualistic. Yet the debate persists. Are these symbols the first flickers of written thought, or maybe something entirely different? The Vincha people also mastered copper. They smelted the metal to create tools, ornaments, and weapons. Not just a few trinkets, but in substantial quantities. This practice may represent the earliest instance of copper metallurgy in the world, emerging even before metallurgy was thought to exist. As far as we can tell, they lived in peace. There are no known fortifications or clear signs of warfare. And then, around 4500 BCE, they vanished. The settlements were abandoned. The symbols fell silent. The stillness arrived. Some suggest climate change, a shift in weather patterns that rendered agriculture unsustainable. Others point to cultural decline, resource depletion, or the arrival of new peoples from the steppes. Whatever the cause, the great Vincha sites, such as Vincha Bello Brodo and Tartaria, gradually fell into ruin. Today they lie mostly beneath fields and cities, their remnants uncovered in fragments by both archaeologists and chants. Their figurines gaze back at us, silent witnesses, as if trying to remember something we have long forgotten. A culture ahead of its time, a script that remains undeciphered, a world consumed not by war but by a mystery inscribed in clay. Once, the Timucua were the dominant culture of northern Florida and southern Georgia. Dozens of chiefdoms numbering tens of thousands of people and speaking dialects of a single language thrived in settlements that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the inland forests. They constructed mounds, cultivated maize, fished in brackish estuaries, and held ceremonies beneath towering palmettos. And yet, most people have never heard their name. Before the Spanish arrived, the Timucua had lived in harmony with their subtropical landscape for centuries. They resided in circular thatched homes arranged around central plazas and organized themselves through complex social hierarchies. Their chiefs had both political and spiritual authority, and lineage played a crucial role in their society. The Timucua practiced an animistic religion, performing rhythmic rituals that often involved dancing, fasting, and body painting, a form of living prayer. When the Spanish first encountered the Timucua in early 1500s, the initial relationship was a cautious balancing act, marked by curiosity, diplomacy, and a hint of tension, but not immediate violence. However, over time, the situation changed dramatically. The Spanish introduced missionaries, churches, crosses, and diseases. That final element hit the hardest, of course. The Timucua had no immunity to smallpox, measles, or influenza. Epidemics swept through villages with astonishing speed. Entire families died within days, and whole settlements were abandoned. Oral traditions recount houses filled with the dead, left untouched out of fear. Between 1600 and 1700, their population plummeted from an estimated 200,000 to only a few hundred survivors. And it wasn't just disease. The Spanish imposed forced conversions, dismantled native traditions, and drew the people into missions. Later, the British arrived from the north, stirring conflict, raiding for slaves, and further destabilizing what remained of the once flourishing culture. By the early 18th century, the Timucua had vanished from the historical record. Some may have fled westward and assimilated into other tribes, while others likely perished in the swampy interiors or during the wars waged by colonial powers. Regardless, their culture, their language, ceremonies, and the memory of their own stories was deliberately erased. Today, only fragments of their legacy remain, a few surviving words, illustrations by early explorers, and burial mounds now overgrown by trees. Their language, once spoken across a vast territory, is now extinct, yet their name endures on road signs, in park names, and in the quiet corners of the southeast. But the people themselves, they have been forgotten. They were the first to greet the European empires in what would become the United States, and among the first to disappear entirely. For tens of thousands of years, they lived on an island of mist and mountains. Long after the rest of the world had changed, they remained unconnected and untouched. The Palawa people of Tasmania, often referred to as the Tasmanians or Tasmans, were isolated when rising sea levels separated the island from mainland Australia around 10,000 years ago. In that isolation, something astonishing occurred. The Tasmans lived in bands that moved through the land in harmony with the seasons. They fished, hunted wallabies, and gathered shellfish. They adorned caves with paintings created using ochre and ash. Their technology was simple, yet effective: stone tools, fire, and an oral tradition of knowledge passed down through millennia. Meanwhile, the centuries passed, the global clock marched on. Agriculture spread across continents, civilizations rose and fell, and innovations like writing, powerful empires, and gunpowder swept across the world. Yet none of these changes reached Tasmania. No metal, no bows, no boats altering their way of life. Yet they survived. They lived with the land, not against it. They set controlled fires to shape the landscape, managed food sources, and tracked the stars. Their world was old, and it still worked. And then came 1642. Dutch explorer Abel Tasman sighted the island that now bears his name. But it wasn't until 1803 that the British arrived in earnest, determined to settle, colonize, and control the island. What followed was brutal. Diseases came first: measles, smallpox, influenza, the same European illnesses that had decimated Native American populations. And then conflict erupted. Land was seized, resources were plundered. The Tasmanians resisted through skirmishes, ambushes, and quiet acts of defiance, but the colonial authorities responded with violence. They called it the Black War. By the 1830s, the surviving Tasmanians, barely a few hundred, were rounded up and forcibly relocated to Flinders Island. They had been promised protection, but instead only found despair, disease, death, and cultural erasure. By 1876, with the death of Truganini, often called the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal, it was said that her people had become extinct. But that's not actually true. Their few descendants lived on, in families and in stories. Although bloodlines diluted, the memory never vanished. Before the Mongols, before Attila, before the Great Wall rose in defense, there were the Xiongnu. Nomadic, ruthless, elusive, emerging on the Mongolian plateau in the 3rd century BCE, they quickly became China's worst nightmare. To the Han emperors, the Xiongnu were barbarians, raiders who struck the northern frontier, looted towns, and then vanished into the steppe. Yet they were much more than that. They formed a confederation of clans and tribes, united under a single leader known as the Xiongnu, a leader of a mobile empire rather than merely a wandering horde. And they were smart. They didn't simply fight, they also negotiated, traded, and engaged in diplomacy as if it were a game of arrows and promises. When the early Han Dynasty found it impossible to defeat them militarily, it resorted to signing peace treaties, sending royal brides, and paying tribute in silk, grain, and gold, all to keep the Xiongnu at bay. The Xiongnu once controlled a vast territory stretching from Manchuria to the Caspian Sea. Their influence spread deep into Central Asia, drawing in smaller nomadic groups and demanding loyalty or tribute. Their mounted archers became the terror of the steppes, silent, swift, and deadly, capable of striking and disappearing before an enemy even had a chance to lace up their boots. However, their empire was never meant to last. Cracks began to appear over time. The Han pushed back decisively. Under Emperor Wu, China launched massive campaigns that cut deep into Xiongnu territory, capturing forts, seizing livestock, and driving wedges between rival factions. The relentless pressure ultimately took its toll, and the Xiongnu Confederation splintered. By the 1st century CE, the once mighty confederation had fractured into two groups: the southern Xiongnu, who submitted to Chinese authority, and the northern Xiongnu, who resisted and paid the price. The northern group was driven further and further westward, eventually fading into the annals of another people's history. And that is where the mystery deepens. Some scholars believe that the northern Xiongnu didn't simply vanish. They transformed into something else. Perhaps they became the Huns who later terrorized Europe, or maybe they merged with other steppe groups like the Huiji or the Gokturks. There's no clear path, no final chapter. Eventually, they just disappear from Chinese records. The Great Wall, originally begun during the Qin dynasty, was built largely to keep the Xiongnu at bay. Think about that. An empire of bricks and bureaucracy, driven by the fear of horsemen. Today, few monuments remain. No palaces, no books, just burial mounds scattered across lonely plains, and the echo of hooves carried on the wind. The Xiongnu didn't build, they rode, and for a time, they ruled. They never built pyramids or palaces. They didn't inscribe their victories into stone or leave behind chronicles of their kings. Instead, the Scythians left something else behind: silence, speed, and bodies buried with gold. From around 900 BCE to 200 BCE, they ruled a vast open steppe stretching from the Black Sea to Mongolia for nearly 1,000 years. Nomads, horsemen, archers without equal, they were true masters of the hit and fade tactic, vanishing into the horizon before their enemies could even raise a shield. Herodotus, the Greek historian, did his best to describe them. He wrote of fierce riders, tattooed warriors, and brutal rituals involving hemp smoke, blood, and earth. He called them savage and strange, yet his words carried both fear and respect. The Scythians had no capital and no centralized state, but they held immense power. They controlled key trade routes, battled the Persians, resisted the Greeks, and later instilled terror in the early Slavic tribes. Their reputation often preceded them, a cavalry force capable of striking from nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. Their art was exquisite: golden plaques depicting deer caught in mid-leap, lions captured in a snarl, and mythic creatures rendered with a contorted elegance. Their masterpieces originated from kurgans, the mound graves that scar the steppe like ancient bruises. Some of these tombs, preserved in the Siberian permafrost, have kept their secrets remarkably well. Human remains, weapons, embroidered clothing, and even tattooed skin still bear swirling animal patterns. But for all their brilliance, the Scythians began to fade. They were never a unified people, but rather a loose confederation of tribes. Over time, external pressures grew. From the west came the Macedonians. From the east, rising powers like the Sarmatians and the Xiongnu. Gradually, their dominance weakened, their territories shrank, and the construction of new tombs dwindled. By the dawn of the 1st century CE, the Scythians had slipped from history. Some merged into other nomadic groups, others may have settled into new societies, but the name, the fearsome free-roaming Scythians, vanished from the maps. And yet, their legacy endured. Their art influenced everything from Persian to Celtic design, and their burial mounds still rise across the steppes. Their memory, oscillating between legend and archaeology, remains one of the most haunting testimonies to a civilization that ruled without walls. No borders, no empire, just wind, hoofbeats, and gold buried beneath the earth. Along Korea's southeastern coast, where gentle hills roll into the East Sea, there once flourished a kingdom of gold, quite literally. The Silla were renowned for their opulence, crown jewels shaped like the trees, belts adorned with jade, and royal tombs where sunlight dances off buried splendor. Yet their story runs deeper than the allure of gold. The Kingdom of Silla endured for over 1,000 years, from 57 BCE to 935 CE, making it one of the longest surviving monarchies in history. It began as one of 3 competing states on the peninsula, alongside Goguryeo and Baishe. But it was different. It was quietly disciplined, spiritually rooted, and politically patient. Its early rulers descended from sacred lineages, claiming divine right through the bone rank system, a rigid hierarchy that governed everything from marriage to office. In this system, you were born in your place and you remained there. Yet within that strict order, something remarkable occurred. Culture flourished. Buddhism entered Silla in the 6th century and reshaped the kingdom. Temples were built, and stone pagodas began to dot the landscape. Sculptors etched serene Buddhas into the granite cliffs, and the capital city of Gyeongju emerged as a beacon of scholarship, art, and engineering. It wasn't just beautiful, it was cosmopolitan. Silla welcomed ideas and artisans from Tang China, Japan, and even distant lands to the west via the Silk Road. In the 7th century, Silla achieved what had once seemed impossible. It unified most of the Korean peninsula under a single rule. With assistance from Tang China, the kingdom defeated Baishe and Goryeo, forging for the first time in history a single unified Korean realm, unified Silla. But unification came with cracks. Aristocratic power deepened, rebellions ignited, and the bone rank system became a confining cage. As the 9th century unfolded, central control frayed, the economy suffered, local warlords emerged, and even Buddhism, once a stabilizing force, became entangled in corruption and politics. By 935 CE, Silla's last king bowed to the rising Goryeo dynasty, a quiet end to a long, storied life. Today, Gyeongju is a city of tombs. Grassy mounds punctuate the landscape, concealing the resting places of kings and queens who once ruled with golden crowns. Some tombs have been opened, revealing ornaments, weapons, and hints of a sophisticated world, while others remain sealed, holding their secrets close. The Silla did not vanish through fire or invasion, they simply aged. They were overtaken, absorbed, yet they left behind an astonishing legacy: architecture, art, the very foundations of what would eventually become Korean identity. It was a golden kingdom that glittered brilliantly before gracefully stepping aside. From about 200 BCE to 500 CE, the Hopewell culture spread throughout the Ohio River Valley. Though it left no written language, towering temples, or royal palaces, it did leave behind something equally remarkable. It left behind mounds. These are massive, geometrically precise earthworks, circles, squares, and serpentine coils stretching for kilometers. Built not by machines, but by hand, each mound was constructed basket by basket, forming what can be seen as spiritual architecture. The Hopewell were not a single tribe or kingdom, but rather a network, a cultural phenomenon unified not by war, but by shared beliefs and trade. They exchanged obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, and mica from the Appalachians, reaching across half the continent. They interred their dead with both care and at times extravagance, adorning burials with beads, finely worked copper tools, intricate effigy pipes, fabrics, and carved stone plaques. Their grave mounds served as portals between the living and the sacred. While some burials were simple, others hinted at social hierarchies, suggesting the presence of a complex, possibly priestly society. But for all their material skill, it's their vision that startles the most. Sites like Newark and the Hopewell Mound Group weren't chosen at random. Their structures aligned with lunar cycles, solstices, and equinoxes, cosmic calendars etched into the soil. Some shapes are so vast that you can only truly appreciate them from the sky. And therein lies the mystery. No known system of measurement, no wheels, no metal tools. Yet they achieved astonishing astronomical precision. And then they stopped. By 500 CE, the Hopewell culture had dissolved. There was no cataclysm, no invading army, just a slow unraveling. Their mound building ceased, trade networks frayed, and their art declined. What followed was centuries of silence. Theories vary. Some say climate change, the arrival of a colder, harsher period, played a role. Others suggest internal shifts, whether spiritual movements, political breakdowns, or even a cultural choice to turn inward. There's no clear sign of a sudden collapse, only a gradual absence. But they didn't vanish completely. Later cultures, like the Mississippians, built mounds of their own. Some descendants still live among native tribes today. The names have changed, but the echoes remain. Today, their mounds rise out of fields and forests, quiet, weathered, and often unnoticed. Most passers-by don't even realize that they're there, yet once, these were sacred centers, vibrant hubs of ceremony, and markers of something profound and extraordinary. They called themselves the Moriori, seafarers who left mainland New Zealand and settled on the Chatham Islands sometime before the 16th century, more than 800 kilometers east of Aotearoa. The islands were isolated, cold, and windswept, the kind of place you'd reach only by accident or by really bold design. In that isolation, something rare happened. They chose peace. Faced with a harsh environment and limited resources, the Moriori developed a code of nonviolence unlike any other in Polynesian culture. They named it Nanuku's Law, after a legendary ancestor who forbade war and cannibalism, with disputes being resolved through ritual, word, or passive resistance. Killing another human wasn't just taboo, it was seen as a betrayal of their very identity. They lived simply. No towering monuments, no grand castles of coral or stone. They fished, hunted seals, and gathered roots. Their homes were light, their society egalitarian, and their traditions passed down orally. They carved rakau mamori, etched trees bearing images of ancestors, spirits, and the natural world. They created living history that grew in the bark. For centuries, they endured. But everything changed. In 1835, two groups of Maori from the North Island, Ngati Mutunga and Ngati Tama, arrived on a hijacked European ship armed with muskets and carrying a very different worldview. The Moriori welcomed them in accordance with their laws, offering food, peace, and dialogue. Yet the newcomers refused to recognize those laws. Within days, the slaughter began. Hundreds were killed, many more were enslaved, forbidden to marry, and forbidden to speak their language or even mention their Moriori identity. For decades, they were forced into silence, their identity trampled underfoot. By the time the British colonial government responded, it was too late. The population had been decimated and the culture broken. By 1933, only 12 people identified as Moriori. To many, they'd effectively ceased to exist. But, well, they hadn't. The story of the Moriori is not merely one of tragedy, it is one of resurgence. In the late 20th century, their descendants began reclaiming their heritage, revitalizing their language, and restoring lost records. In 2001, the New Zealand government formally acknowledged their suffering and initiated a process of cultural reparation. Today, the Moriori are far more than a footnote in history. They possess a voice, a marae, a community focal point, and a future. Yet, their narrative still cuts deeply because they were not subjugated for land or wealth. Instead, they were dismantled simply for being different, for choosing peace in a world that was unprepared to accept it. And yet, despite everything, they continued to persevere. Long before the pharaohs began constructing tombs along the Nile, a different people gathered around a lake that no longer exists. Nabta Playa, an ancient, now arid basin in southern Egypt's Sahara, once served as a seasonal refuge. It was here, over 7,000 years ago, that something truly astonishing took place. They built a stone circle, a megalithic structure that was small in size but huge in implication. It was arranged with precision and aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, built long before Stonehenge, before Sumer, and before civilization as we define it. So who were they? Well, these were not city builders or kings. They were nomadic herders, moving with the rains, tending to cattle, and living on the land. Yet, they were far from primitive. They understood the sky, the stars, and the turning of the seasons. They constructed ceremonial sites, burial mounds, and alignments that suggest a deep and sustained astronomical observation. It is believed that they were the first in Africa to domesticate cattle. Their bones reveal evidence of ritual slaughter and careful placement, hinting that they may have even possessed a calendar, one that tracked the rising of Sirius. This celestial event later became crucial in Egyptian culture for predicting the inundation of the Nile. Archaeologists have unearthed megaliths, pottery, stone tools, and bones arranged in symbolic forms. Some scholars argue that Nabta Playa laid the groundwork for the spiritual and cosmic thinking that would eventually blossom in ancient Egypt. And then the rain stopped. Around 5,000 years ago, the Sahara began to dry up. The lake gradually shrank until it eventually vanished, and the people moved on, likely heading eastward toward the Nile. The site was abandoned, swallowed by the encroaching sand. Yet their knowledge may have journeyed with them. Some consider Nabta Playa a missing link, a proto-culture whose astronomical insights and complex rituals laid the groundwork for early Egyptian religion. Others view it as an isolated marvel, a brief burst of brilliance emerging from a forgotten oasis. What remains certain is this. Thousands of years ago, someone stood in that forsaken desert and carved marks in stone to chart the heavens. There were no pyramids yet, no hieroglyphs, just a circle in the sand aligned precisely with the rising sun, and it still stands. Deep within southern Africa, where expansive grasslands meet ancient towering baobabs, lie the ruins of an extraordinary civilization. Massive stone walls, towering structures built without mortar, and enclosures that once hosted kings and ceremonies now lie open to the sky, filled with birdsong. This is Great Zimbabwe. Once it was the seat of a kingdom rich, complex, and fiercely proud. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe arose around the 11th century CE, built by the ancestors of the Xiongnu people. At its peak, it controlled vast trade networks across southern Africa. Gold, ivory, and cattle sustained the kingdom, while merchants arrived from the Swahili coast, the Middle East, and even China. Glass beads, Persian pottery, and Chinese ceramics discovered among the ruins attest to its global connections, proof that this was no isolated backwater. At its heart stood Great Zimbabwe itself, an urban complex spanning nearly 800 hectares. Its architecture is breathtaking, with walls over 10 meters high, constructed from granite blocks that fit together perfectly without any binding material. The Great Enclosure, the most famous section, houses a soaring conical tower whose purpose remains unknown. For years, European colonists insisted that Africans could not have built such structures. They invented stories of lost white tribes, Phoenicians, and even the Queen of Sheba. Anything to deny the reality before them, a native African civilization that mastered stonework, trade, and power. But it was the Xiongnu. It always was. The kingdom lasted for over 300 years. At its height, it may have governed more than 20,000 people living in and around the city. Chiefs, spiritual leaders, traders, and farmers flourished in a network of settlements interconnected by kinship, tribute, and faith. By the 15th century, however, the kingdom began to wane. The reasons for this decline remain debated. Overgrazing, the exhaustion of nearby gold mines, internal strife, and shifting trade routes all may have played a part. Gradually, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned as wealth and influence moved north to new centers like Matapa. It wasn't destroyed, it was just left behind. The ruins endured, half forgotten by the world, until the 19th century, when outsiders rediscovered them. Yet, they never truly disappeared. The local people always knew they were there. The stones didn't remain silent. They just waited for the noise to fade. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands as a national symbol. The country itself bears its name, and still the walls stand, unmortared, unyielding, unmoved by time. Before the Aztecs, before Spanish ships touched the coast, long before history wielded its pen, there were the Toltecs. They emerged around 900 CE in the arid heart of central Mexico, centering their power in the great city of Tula, or Tlan as it was once called. Today, stone warriors still stand there, tall, imposing, and silent, on a temple platform, watching over the ruins like ghosts frozen in basalt. The Toltecs were builders, warriors, and artisans. They inherited the legacy of Teotihuacan and wove together an empire that stretched deep into Mesoamerica. Their architecture was robust, functional, and rich with symbolism. Their capital fused power with precision, towering pyramids, grand columned halls, and statues of Atlantean figures clutching at lattice and blades, each exuding the calm menace of long-forgotten gods. Yet the Toltecs were more than mere stone and war. They were myth-makers, or perhaps they themselves became myth. Later cultures, especially the Aztecs, regarded the Toltecs much like we view Atlantis. To the Aztecs, Toltecayote did not simply refer to from Tollen. It encompassed craftsmanship, artistry, and wisdom. To be a Toltec was to embody civilization in its truest form. But that very reverence makes it hard to pin them down. Historians must sift through legend like gold dust scattered in the sand. One name always rises from the haze, though: Quetzalcoatl. More than just a feathered serpent god, he was a king, a priest, a bringer of light and knowledge, said to have ruled the Toltecs before being betrayed and exiled. Some even say he sailed east on a raft of serpents, vowing to return. Was he real? Was he a metaphor? Was he a myth wrapped around a man? Well, that's the Toltec paradox. It's half history, it's half smoke. And then, sometime in the 12th century, it all ended. Tula fell, burned, and was abandoned. The causes remain unclear. Some blame drought, while others point to internal strife. Perhaps the nomadic Chichimeca invaders from the north helped tip the balance. Whatever the reason, the empire collapsed. Yet its memory did not fade. The Aztecs claimed descent from the Toltecs, adopting their gods, mimicking their architecture, and even styling their rulers after Quetzalcoatl. It's rare for an entire culture to vanish yet cast a shadow that spans the centuries. Today, Tula lies in partial ruin. Its statues still stand, its temples bear the marks of time, and many questions remain unanswered. Were the Toltecs as great as legend suggests? Well, perhaps. But maybe they were even greater. For over 1,000 years, the kingdom of Anuradhapura served as the beating heart of Sri Lanka, a realm of kings, monks, and miracles. Founded in the 4th century BCE, it was not merely a political center, it was a sacred landscape, a living testament to Buddhism carved into both jungle and stone. The city takes its name from its founder, Prince Anuradha, but it was King Devanampia Tissa who imbued it with spiritual significance. Around 250 BC, emissaries from the Indian Emperor Ashoka arrived with both a message and a mission. They introduced Buddhism by bringing a cutting from the tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. That sapling was planted in Anuradhapura and still grows today, the oldest historically documented tree in the world. From that moment on, Anuradhapura became more than a city. It transformed into a beacon. Massive stupas rose from the earth. Some soared even taller than the pyramids, and their white domes stood out against the deep blue sky. Beneath them, relics, offerings, and the dreams of civilization flowed like water. Monasteries spread across the countryside, and irrigation systems, tanks, and canals alike turned arid plains into vibrant, rice-rich fields. This was not a kingdom defined by brute force. It was a realm built on order and devotion. Kings ruled from palaces with moonstone steps and guard stones intricately etched with lions and serpents. They enacted laws, built roads, and patronized monks even as they fought against invaders, rebels, and sometimes each other. Power shifted and dynasties rose and fell, yet Anuradhapura endured. Until it didn't endure. By the 10th century CE, the kingdom began to falter. Repeated invasions from South India weakened its defenses, and internal strife fractured its leadership. Then in 993 CE, the Chola dynasty struck a final blow. The capital was sacked, and the city, once alive with chants, processions, and the bustle of royal courts, was ultimately abandoned. The heart moved south to Polonnaruwa, to new dynasties, to new dreams. Anuradhapura was left to the forest, yet it wasn't forgotten. Pilgrims still came, and they still come. Monks continue to tend the sacred tree, stupas are repainted, and rituals are repeated. Beneath tangled roots and stone blocks, archaeologists persist in uncovering the bones of a lost world. Anuradhapura didn't die. It became a ruin, sure, but also it turned into a symbol of endurance, of memory, and of the weight that a sacred place can carry across time. Long before cruise ships and colonial ports dotted the Caribbean, the islands were home to a fierce seafaring people, the Kalinago. Often misnamed Caribs by early European explorers, the Kalinago dominated the Lesser Antilles when Columbus arrived in 1493. Centuries earlier, they had sailed northward from South America, expanding across the islands in long, sleek canoes carved from tree trunks, crafts that were fast, silent, and deadly. Their warriors were feared, their culture vibrant, and their world was imperiled the moment Europe came knocking. To the Spanish, they were demons. To the French and English, they were obstacles. But to themselves, they were guardians, defenders of their land, their sea, and their way of life. They were neither peaceful utopians nor savage raiders. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. The Kalinago practiced a culture distinctly different from that of their Arawakan neighbors. They were animists, believing that nature, every tree, storm, and stone possessed its own spirit. They cultivated cassava, crafted hammocks and poetry, adorned their skin with paint, and tattooed their bodies with symbols of rank and power. Trained for war from an early age, they became known for their guerrilla tactics, striking fast with lethal precision before disappearing into the shadows. They resisted colonization with all the force at their disposal. When the Spanish attempted to settle in the Lesser Antilles, they were repeatedly driven out. The Kalinago knew the ins and outs of both land and sea. They attacked ships, burned outposts, and took prisoners. To the Europeans, they were fearsome, a people both difficult to understand and even more challenging to defeat. But guns, germs, and greed do not yield easily. By the 17th century, the French and British had secured a foothold. Treaties were made and then broken, land was seized, disease spread, rebellions flared, and the Kalinago population began to decline. In 1626, the British launched a brutal campaign on St. Kitts. In 1660, the Treaty of St. Charles was signed, dividing the Caribbean among European powers and acknowledging the small portion of Kalinago land that remained. Over time, even that was taken. By the 18th century, the Kalinago had been pushed to the edges. Their numbers dwindled, and their name faded into misused myth. Yet, not all was lost. On the island of Dominica, the Kalinago survived, though only barely. Today, the Kalinago territory preserves what remains of their culture: language, crafts, rituals, and stories, a revival identity rising from centuries of near erasure. High on the Horn of Africa, where cliffs drop into the Red Sea and the highlands ripple with ancient stone, the kingdom of Damit once stood, quiet, powerful, largely forgotten. It existed between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE in what are now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. This civilization of farmers, metal workers, and builders was nestled in the mountains above the desert. Their capital, Iha, still stands in ghostly fragments, a temple constructed of polished sandstone blocks, fitted so precisely that not even a knife could be slipped between them. It is one of the oldest standing structures in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet, its story is nearly erased. Damit remains a mystery. There are no annals or royal lineages to guide us. What little we know comes from ruins, inscriptions, and cautious comparisons. Some of these inscriptions are in South Arabian script, a hint of Sabian influence from across the Red Sea in present-day Yemen. Were they colonized, trading partners, or simply neighbors engaged in a cultural dialogue? We just don't know for sure. What we do know is that Damit harnessed iron, irrigated highland farms, and built temples, palaces, and fortresses atop natural stone outcrops. Their society was complex, hierarchical and spiritual, likely tied to moon and sun gods. They thrived in a region that would later evolve into Africa's political and religious crossroads. Sometime after 500 BCE, Damit vanished, not through destruction, but by gradual dissolving. Historians believe it fragmented into smaller states that were eventually absorbed into the rising kingdom of Aksum. This transition was not marked by war or catastrophe, but by a gentle handover, as one kingdom gradually faded into another. What makes Damit so haunting is how easily it slipped through history's fingers. Its name was not celebrated in epic or scripture, and its kings were never immortalized. For centuries, even scholars were unaware of its existence. It was only in the 20th century, when archaeologists began to dig deeper, that a faint outline of Damit reappeared, like breath on glass. Yeh's temple remains the crown jewel of this forgotten realm, a structure that defied the odds by surviving through time. Today, you can still stand inside it, watching the light slant across ancient stones, and marvel at how a kingdom could construct such remarkable architecture, yet be so thoroughly forgotten. Long before Jerusalem became holy grounds, before the Israelites, before Rome, and even before the Greeks cast their eyes across the Mediterranean, there were the Canaanites. They were not a singular kingdom, but rather a patchwork of city-states scattered across what we now know as Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, western Jordan, and southern Syria. Names like Sidon, Tyre, Ugarit, and Byblos are etched into both stone and myth. Thriving as early as 3000 BCE, they left behind one of the most fascinating legacies of the ancient world. Yet today, the term Canaanite seems to function more as a shadow than as a clearly defined identity, spoken frequently yet only understood rarely. They were traders, sailors, builders, and pioneers of the early alphabet. For example, the city of Ugarit contributed one of the earliest known alphabets, a forerunner to Phoenician script that eventually influenced Greek, Latin, and even the alphabet that you read every day. Their religion was complex and layered, weaving together powerful deities and brutal tales. Baal, the storm god, often battled Mot, the god of death. Their stories, preserved on clay tablets, echo later biblical themes, yet have older roots. Temples rose in the cities, heavy with incense and sacrifice, while sacred groves and high places punctuated their spiritual life. They lived in mud brick homes and traded tin, timber, purple dye, and wine as the middlemen of the ancient world. They linked the great civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. For centuries, they endured droughts, invasions, shifting alliances, and the complexities of diplomacy. Then came the collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age shattered. Cities burned, trade routes died, and mysterious sea peoples emerged like a sudden storm from the west. Ugarit fell, and soon others followed, fracturing the Canaanite world. Some cities survived in name, but had changed in spirit. New peoples arrived. The Philistines, Israelites, Arameans, and the Canaanites were not wiped out in a single battle. Instead, they were absorbed, rebranded, and their history was rewritten. In the Bible, they are often portrayed as the other, idolaters, enemies, examples of what not to be. Yet, archaeology tells a more nuanced story. They were neighbors, kin, and perhaps even ancestors. Their blood runs deep in the Levant, whether remembered or not. Their cities may now be ruins, stone foundations, broken tablets, and fragments of pottery tucked away in museum drawers, but their fingerprints remain everywhere, in language, myth, scripture, and even the very shape of our alphabet. The Canaanites never built an empire, yet their influence helped shape the world. In the turquoise waters between Japan and Taiwan lies Okinawa, a place of subtropical beauty, rugged cliffs, and soft ocean mists. Behind the laid-back surf and fields of sugarcane, however, lies a story few people know: the rise and quiet fall of the Ryukyu Kingdom. For 450 years, Ryukyu was a maritime kingdom unlike any other in East Asia. It emerged in the early 15th century and transformed from a collection of warring chiefdoms into a unified state under King Shohashi. His court was established at Shuri Castle, a fortress built of coral stone and bright red tiles that crowned the hills above Nahas Harbor. What made Ryukyu special wasn't conquest, it was diplomacy and trade. They never sought to rival China or Japan. Instead, they danced between the two. They sent tribute missions to the Ming dynasty, adopted Confucian statecrafts, and in return received silk, books, silver, and legitimacy. Their slender, swift, and expertly crafted ships sailed as far as Southeast Asia. Ryukyuan sailors carried Japanese swords to China, Chinese porcelain to Korea, and Indian glass beads to Japan. They were cultural chameleons, multilingual, multicultural, and astonishingly adaptive. Back home, the arts flourished, giving rise to unique forms of music and dance, a rich oral tradition, and a native religion rooted in ancestor worship, sacred groves, and priestesses called Noro who held spiritual authority long before monks or samurai ever set foot on the islands. For centuries, Ryukyu maintained its independence through subtlety rather than force. Yet geography proved to be a challenging neighbor. In 1609, the Satsuma clan from southern Japan invaded. The kingdom survived, though it did so under a shadow. Ryukyu became a vassal of Japan, while still paying tribute to China, living a double life as it carefully balanced the demands of two masters for over 250 years. And then came modernity. In 1879, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan formally annexed Ryukyu. The king was deposed, and the kingdom became Okinawa Prefecture. Its language, once the court tongue, was banned in schools. Its temples were neglected, and its identity gradually faded, overwritten by burgeoning nationalism. But it was not entirely erased. Today, Okinawa retains a distinct rhythm. Its music, food, and beliefs evoke the legacy of an old kingdom that once navigated between giants and dared to chart its own course. Shuri Castle still stands, lovingly rebuilt after fire and war, a symbol and a testament to what refuses to be forgotten. The Ryukyu Kingdom did not vanish in a blaze of glory. Instead, it yielded, slowly, to the rising tide of change. 50 vanished civilizations today. They have all disappeared, not only as fairy tales, but as remnants lost in dust, stone, and silence. Each one once built something enduring until it did not last. Some succumbed to the ravages of war, others to the relentless forces of weather, disease, or gradual decline, and some simply faded away, quietly, without any clear reason at all. Their stories remind us that even the strongest societies are not immune to dramatic change, even to a cataclysmic fall. It makes you wonder, what will future generations, or even future civilizations, say about ours? Thank you for watching.